Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 6 deeply disturbing true Appalachian deep woods horror stories that will make you question what really lurks in America's most ancient and mysterious mountain forests. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who ventured too deep into places where modern civilization has never truly taken hold. Each story has been carefully researched and verified through witness testimonials and supporting evidence. The mountains of Appalachia hold secrets that most people will never understand. And perhaps that is for the best. If you enjoy authentic horror content that will keep you awake at night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own encounters with the unexplained. Now settle in as we explore the darkness that dwells in the deep woods. I have been bow hunting the Cherokee National Forest for 15 years. I know these ridges like the back of my weathered hands. I can tell you which hollows hold the biggest bucks, which creek beds run dry by August, and which stands of oak produce the sweetest acorns that draw deer from miles around. But what happened during the 2019 season made me hang up my bow for good. It started with the feeling of being watched. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am 43 years old. I have lived in East Tennessee my entire life, raised on these mountains by a grandfather who taught me that the forest provides for those who respect it. I learned to read signs in the dirt, to move silent as smoke through the underbrush, and to understand the language that animals speak with their movement and behavior. I thought I understood these mountains completely. I was wrong. October 15th, 2019, opening day of archery season. I had been scouting a particular ridge since late August, watching a massive 10-point buck that would wander down to drink from a spring-fed creek every morning around 7:30. This deer was easily the largest I had ever seen in these parts, with a rack that would make any hunter proud. I had my stand positioned perfectly, downwind about 30 yards from his drinking spot, hidden in a cluster of mature white oaks that blocked my silhouette from below. I arrived at my hunting spot 3 hours before dawn, as is my custom. The walk from my truck took about 40 minutes through terrain that would challenge most people. But I could navigate these deer trails blindfolded. The morning was crisp, probably around 38 degrees, with a light frost that would burn off once the sun cleared the ridgeline. Perfect hunting weather. The kind of morning that makes you grateful to be alive and in the woods. I settled into my tree stand and began the patient wait that every bow hunter knows well. This is meditation time, when you become part of the forest ecosystem. Your breathing slows, your senses sharpen, and you start to notice things that hurried people miss entirely. The way squirrels communicate danger through specific chatter patterns. How birds go silent when predators move through their territory. The subtle changes in wind direction that carry scent in unexpected ways. But something felt different that morning. I had hunted this exact spot 6 times during my pre-season scouting, and the forest had always welcomed me with familiar sounds and rhythms. This time, there was an underlying tension that I could not identify. The squirrels were quiet. Too quiet. Even the ever-present chatter of chipmunks seemed muted and nervous. I attributed it to opening day jitters and tried to focus on watching for my target buck. 7:20 came and went with no sign of the deer. This was unusual, but not alarming. Wildlife patterns can shift for dozens of reasons, from changes in food sources to pressure from other hunters in adjacent areas. I decided to wait until 10 o'clock before climbing down and checking the area for fresh sign. That was when I first felt the eyes on me. Every hunter knows this sensation. It is primal and unmistakable. Something was watching me with focused intensity. I slowly scanned the forest around my position, moving only my eyes at first, then gradually turning my head to check different angles. Nothing visible. But the feeling persisted and grew stronger. I spent the next 2 hours in a state of heightened alert, constantly scanning the woods while trying to maintain focus on my hunting area. The sensation of being observed never faded. It was like having someone stare at you from across a crowded room. Except I was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness. Or at least, I thought I was alone. Around 9:30, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large had shifted position about 60 yards to my left, behind a thick stand of mountain laurel. I watched that spot for 10 minutes without seeing anything else. But I knew something was there. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it seemed to have a specific direction and source. I decided to investigate. I climbed down from my stand as quietly as possible and moved toward the laurel thicket where I had seen the movement. My bow was nocked and ready, though I had no intention of shooting at an unidentified target. Safety rules are never optional, regardless of how curious or unsettled you might feel. As I approached the area, I found sign that made my blood run cold. Footprints, human footprints, but not the boot prints you would expect from another hunter. These were bare feet, and they were enormous. At least size 15, maybe larger, with unusually long toes and what appeared to be thick calluses on the soles and sides. The prints formed a clear trail that led from the laurel thicket to a position that would have given whoever made them a perfect view of my tree stand. They had been watching me, studying me. For how long, I had no way of knowing. I followed the trail for about 100 yards, becoming increasingly disturbed by what I found. The prints showed someone who moved with complete silence and confidence through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. Whoever had made these tracks knew exactly where to step to avoid breaking branches or disturbing loose rocks. They had positioned themselves to observe me while remaining completely hidden. The trail led to a natural rock outcropping that provided an elevated view of the entire valley where I had been hunting. From this position, someone could watch multiple hunting areas simultaneously and track the movement of anyone entering or leaving the forest. It was a surveillance point, and it had been used recently and extensively. I found evidence of a long-term presence. Fire rings that had been carefully constructed to produce minimal smoke. Crude shelters built from deadfall and natural materials. Food caches hidden in rock crevices and hollow logs. Someone had been living in these mountains, and they had been watching hunters and other visitors for an extended period. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found what appeared to be a journal, wrapped in deer hide and wedged into a crack in the rocks. The pages were filled with observations written in a crude but legible hand. Descriptions of hunters, hikers, and campers who had passed through the area over what must have been several months. Details about their equipment, their routes, their habits, and their schedules. My name was in that journal. Multiple entries describing my scouting trips, my hunting patterns, and even specific details about my equipment and clothing. Someone had been documenting my presence in these mountains with the thoroughness of a scientific researcher. But the tone of the entries was not scientific. It was possessive and increasingly hostile. The final entry, dated just 2 days before opening day, contained a message that made me understand how much danger I was in. It read, "Thompson comes too often, thinks he owns this ridge. Time to teach him about respect. Time to show him who really lives here." I was was being hunted. I left that outcropping as quickly and quietly as possible, but I knew my situation had fundamentally changed. Someone was living wild in these mountains. Someone who considered my presence an intrusion that required correction. I had stumbled into a territorial dispute with something that was no longer entirely human. The walk back to my tree stand felt like the longest 40 minutes of my life. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. Every sound could signal an approaching threat. I had gone from being a predator to being prey, and the role reversal was psychologically devastating. When I reached my hunting area, I found that my tree stand had been disturbed. Someone had climbed up and gone through my gear. My thermos was open, my calls were scattered, and my scent eliminator had been poured out on the ground. It was a message, clear and unmistakable. I was not welcome here. But the real message was waiting at my truck. All 4 tires had been slashed with what appeared to be a large knife or machete. The cuts were clean and deliberate, designed to strand me in the mountains rather than simply disable my vehicle. Someone wanted me to understand that leaving would not be simple or easy. I used my cell phone to call for help, but I had no signal. The mountains in this area are notorious for poor cellular coverage, and I was effectively cut off from the outside world. I was stranded, being hunted by someone who knew these mountains better than I did, and night would be falling in less than 6 hours. I made the decision to hike out on foot rather than spend the night in my truck. The walk to the nearest road was approximately 8 miles through difficult terrain, but it seemed safer than remaining stationary and vulnerable. I packed my essential gear and began what I knew would be a challenging trek. The hike became a nightmare within the first hour. I was being stalked. I could hear movement in the forest around me, always just out of sight, but clearly shadowing my route. Branches would snap in the distance. Rocks would clatter down slopes when no wind was blowing. And always, that sensation of being watched by hostile eyes. 3 times I stopped and called out, identifying myself as a hunter and asking whoever was following me to show themselves. The responses chilled my soul. Not words, but sounds. Guttural vocalizations that seemed half human and half animal. Calls that spoke of rage and territorial aggression and something that had moved beyond normal human behavior. By the 4th mile, I realized that my stalker was not trying to remain hidden anymore. He wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to be afraid. The psychological pressure was constant and building towards something that I did not want to experience. I began finding signs that he was moving ahead of me, positioning himself along my route. Fresh footprints crossing the trail I was following. Broken branches that had been snapped within the last few minutes. The unmistakable evidence that someone was setting up an ambush. Mile 6 brought the first direct contact. A rock, easily 5 pounds, came crashing through the trees and struck a pine trunk less than 3 feet from my head. The impact was so violent that bark exploded in all directions, and the sound echoed through the valley like a gunshot. There was no mistaking this for an accident or natural occurrence. Someone had thrown that rock with enough force to kill me if their aim had been better. I started running. The final 2 miles became a desperate flight through terrain that I knew could break an ankle or worse if I made a wrong step. But staying still meant facing whatever had been stalking me through the mountains. And I had no illusions about my chances in that confrontation. My bow would be useless at close range, and I was dealing with someone who had been living wild long enough to become something other than a normal human being. The sounds of pursuit followed me all the way to the road. Crashing through underbrush, inhuman vocalizations, and the constant sense of something large and aggressive closing the distance between us. I have never been more grateful to see asphalt and civilization than I was that evening when I finally stumbled out of the forest. A passing motorist stopped and gave me a ride to town, where I reported the incident to the local sheriff's department. They were polite, but clearly skeptical of my story. Vandalism and petty theft are common problems in areas with heavy hunting traffic, and they seemed to think I had encountered nothing more than local troublemakers trying to discourage competition. But I knew what I had experienced, and I knew it was far more dangerous than simple vandalism. I never went back to retrieve my truck or my tree stand. I wrote them off as a complete loss and considered it cheap tuition for a lesson that probably saved my life. The Cherokee National Forest is home to more than bears and deer. Something lives in those deep hollows and remote ridges that has chosen to remain hidden from modern civilization. Something that considers the mountains its exclusive territory and will defend that territory with lethal force. I sold my hunting equipment and have not returned to those mountains since 2019. I tell people that I lost interest in hunting, but the truth is that I learned I was never the apex predator I thought I was. Something else holds that position in the deep woods of Appalachia, and it does not welcome visitors or competition. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel those eyes watching me. I know it is just psychological aftermath from a traumatic experience, but the sensation is real and unsettling. I have trouble sleeping when the moon is full, and I find myself checking locks and looking out windows at shadows that probably contain nothing more dangerous than neighborhood cats. But probably is not the same as certainly. And I learned in those mountains that the impossible and the deadly can be the same thing. I am sharing this story not for attention or sympathy, but as a warning. The Cherokee National Forest, like many wilderness areas in Appalachia, contains things that do not appear on any official map or wildlife survey. If you hunt or hike in these mountains, understand that you are entering territory that belongs to something else. Something that has been there longer than our civilization and has no intention of yielding that territory to weekend visitors. Pay attention to the signs. Trust your instincts. And if you ever find yourself being watched by something that feels wrong and dangerous, do not investigate. Do not try to prove how brave or skilled you are. Leave immediately and do not return. Some lessons are too expensive to learn through personal experience, and some territories are not worth fighting over. The mountains will always be there, but you might not be if you push too hard into places where you are not welcome. That is the truth I learned in October 2019, and it is a truth that changed my relationship with the wilderness forever. I thought I understood these mountains, but they taught me that understanding and survival are not always the same thing. I was documenting abandoned settlements in the Monongahela National Forest for my graduate thesis in Appalachian Studies. The cabin I found on October 13th was not on any historical record, yet it contained fresh supplies and recent activity from the 1920s. What I experienced there has made me question everything I thought I understood about time, reality, and the nature of existence itself. I need to tell someone this story before I lose my mind completely. My name is Ashley Rivera, and I am 26 years old. I was pursuing my master's degree in Appalachian Studies at West Virginia University when this happened. My thesis focused on the settlement patterns of early 20th century homesteaders in remote areas of the Monongahela, specifically examining how isolated communities developed unique cultural practices and survival strategies. I had spent 8 months researching historical documents, land surveys, and oral histories, building a comprehensive database of forgotten settlements that once dotted these mountains. My advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, had encouraged me to pursue fieldwork as part of my research methodology. She believed that physically visiting these historical sites would provide insights that could not be gained through academic sources alone. I agreed with this approach and had already successfully located and documented 12 abandoned homesteads using a combination of old property maps, geological surveys, and GPS coordinates derived from historical land grants. The 13th site should have been routine. According to a 1919 property deed I had discovered in the Tucker County Courthouse, a family named Brennan had established a homestead on 40 acres of what was then private land, approximately 6 miles southeast of Parsons. The deed indicated they had built a cabin, cleared several acres for farming, and maintained the property for at least 5 years before apparently abandoning it sometime in the mid-1920s. Federal land acquisition records from 1933 showed that the property had been incorporated into the newly established Monongahela National Forest, but there was no mention of any structures being removed or demolished. This suggested that the cabin might still be standing, which would make it an invaluable research site for understanding how these isolated families had lived and worked. I planned a 3-day solo camping trip to locate and document the Brennan homestead. My equipment included professional camera gear, measuring tools, soil sampling supplies, and metal detection equipment for finding buried artifacts. I also carried detailed topographical maps, GPS units, and enough food and camping supplies to sustain me for up to a week if weather or other circumstances extended my stay. The hike to the approximate location of the homestead took most of the first day. The terrain was challenging, with steep ridges and dense undergrowth that had reclaimed what might once have been crude logging roads. I was following compass bearings based on the original property survey, adjusting for magnetic declination and trying to account for nearly a century of landscape changes. By late afternoon on October 13th, I had reached the general area where the cabin should have been located. According to my calculations, I was within a quarter-mile radius of the original homestead site, but I had not yet found any evidence of human habitation. No foundation stones, no cleared areas, no fruit trees or other indicators that a family had once lived and worked this land. I decided to establish my base camp and conduct a systematic search pattern the following morning. I found a relatively flat area near a small creek and set up my tent as the sun was beginning to set behind the western ridges. The forest around my campsite was typical of this elevation and latitude. Mature hardwoods mixed with pine, thick undergrowth of rhododendron and mountain laurel, and the kind of deep wilderness silence that city people find either peaceful or unsettling. I fell asleep easily that first night, tired from the long hike and confident that I would locate the Brennan cabin sometime the next day. My research methodology was thorough, and I had successfully found every other site I had sought. There was no reason to think this search would be any different. I was wrong in ways that I am still trying to understand. I woke up the next morning to the smell of wood smoke. This was immediately alarming because I had not built a fire the previous evening, preferring to eat cold food and avoid the risk of wildfire in an area where I might not be able to get help quickly if something went wrong. Yet the smell was unmistakable, and it was close. Very close. I unzipped my tent and looked around the campsite. No visible fire, no smoke. But the smell was stronger outside than it had been inside my tent. It was the specific scent of hardwood burning in a well-maintained fireplace or wood stove, not the acrid smell of a forest fire or carelessly managed campfire. I dressed quickly and began following my nose toward the source of the smoke. The scent trail led me southeast, up a gentle slope through a stand of mature oak trees that I had not explored the previous day. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw it. A log cabin that had not been there the day before. I know how that sounds. I know what the rational explanations might be. I had been tired during my initial survey. The cabin was positioned in a natural depression that concealed it from most angles. The late afternoon light had been insufficient for proper visibility. There were a dozen reasons why I might have missed seeing a structure during my preliminary reconnaissance. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that this cabin had not existed the day before. The building was in remarkable condition for something that should have been abandoned for nearly a century. The log walls were solid and well chinked. The roof appeared to be in excellent repair. The windows had glass that was clean and unbroken. Most significantly, smoke was rising from the stone chimney, indicating an active fire inside. I approached carefully, unsure whether the cabin might be occupied by squatters, hunters, or some other modern presence that could explain what I was seeing. I called out several times, identifying myself as a researcher and asking if anyone was home. No response, but the front door was standing slightly ajar, as if inviting investigation. I decided to document the exterior before attempting to enter. Using my professional camera, I shot multiple angles of the structure, paying particular attention to construction details that might help date the building. What I saw through the viewfinder made no sense. The cabin appeared to have been built using early 20th century techniques and materials. Hand-hewn logs secured with traditional joinery. Foundation stones that showed the wear patterns of decades of seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. A stone chimney constructed with the kind of skilled masonry that was common in rural Appalachian construction from the 1910s and 1920s. But everything was too well preserved, too clean, too maintained for a structure that had supposedly been abandoned for nearly 100 years. I documented everything I could from the exterior, then approached the front door. It swung open at my touch, revealing an interior that defied rational explanation. The cabin was furnished and occupied. Not recently occupied, currently occupied. The fire in the stone fireplace was burning with fresh wood. The kitchen area contained food supplies that appeared to be in current use. Clothing hung from pegs on the walls. Personal possessions were scattered around the single room in the casual way that indicates active habitation. But everything was wrong. Historically wrong. The food supplies were in packaging that I recognized from historical photographs. Glass jars with handwritten labels. Cloth sacks containing flour and sugar. Preserved meats hanging from the rafters in the traditional mountain style. The clothing was period appropriate, but appeared to be recently worn and recently cleaned. The personal possessions told the same story. A straight razor and leather strop on a wooden washstand. Kerosene lamps with clean glass chimneys and recently trimmed wicks. Books and newspapers that bore dates from 1923 and 1924, but appeared to have been read recently and handled frequently. Most disturbing of all, there were signs of current activity. Wet dishes in a wooden wash basin. Food remains on a plate that suggested someone had eaten breakfast within the last few hours. Coffee grounds in a pot that was still slightly warm to the touch. I began photographing everything, trying to document what I was seeing while simultaneously trying to understand what I was experiencing. This was not an abandoned homestead that had been preserved by unusual environmental conditions. This was not a historical recreation or a museum exhibit. This was a cabin that appeared to be actively inhabited by people who were living in the 1920s. As I worked, I became aware of sounds outside. Footsteps on the wooden porch. Voices speaking in low tones that I could not quite make out. The sounds of daily activity that suggested people were approaching the cabin with the casual familiarity of residents returning home. I moved to the window and looked out, expecting to see modern people who might explain this impossible situation. Instead, I saw two figures dressed in clothing from the 1920s, walking toward the cabin with the easy confidence of people returning to their own home. The man was wearing work clothes that I recognized from historical photographs. Canvas pants, a cotton shirt, and leather boots that showed the wear patterns of daily use. The woman was dressed in a simple cotton dress with an apron, her hair arranged in a style that was popular in the early 1920s. They were talking to each other in voices that carried clearly through the morning air, but I could not understand what they were saying. Not because they were speaking quietly, but because the language itself seemed strange. It was recognizably English, but with an accent and vocabulary that sounded archaic, like something from a much earlier time period. I realized that I was about to be discovered in their home, and I had no idea how to explain my presence or my equipment. I quickly gathered my camera and notes and moved toward the back door, hoping to retreat without being seen. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The woman was calling my name, not calling to me, but talking about me. She was telling the man that Ashley was here, looking through our things again. She spoke about me as if my presence was expected, routine, something that happened regularly. I had never seen these people before in my life. I pushed through the back door and ran toward the tree line, no longer concerned with stealth or documentation. I needed distance and time to process what I had experienced. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the man call out behind me, "Ashley, you do not need to run. You always come back anyway." I kept running until I reached my campsite, then quickly broke camp and began hiking toward my vehicle. I needed to leave this area immediately and return with other people who could witness what I had found. Preferably people with expertise in paranormal phenomena or unexplained occurrences, because I was clearly dealing with something outside normal experience. But when I reached the spot where I had parked my truck, I found something that made me question my sanity completely. My vehicle was not there. In its place was a different truck, older and less familiar, but with my gear loaded in the bed exactly as I had left it. The keys in my pocket started this different truck, and the registration in the glove compartment bore my name and address. I drove back to Morgantown in a state of complete psychological confusion. Nothing made sense. My memory of events was clear and detailed, but the physical evidence suggested a reality that contradicted everything I thought I knew about my own life and experiences. When I reached my apartment, I found more impossibilities waiting for me. My research notes contained documentation of 13 abandoned homesteads, including detailed photographs and measurements of the Brennan cabin. According to my own handwriting, I had visited that site multiple times over the past several months and had maintained regular contact with the residents as part of my ongoing research. But I had no memory of any previous visits to that location. My computer contained gigabytes of photographs showing the cabin in different seasons, different weather conditions, and different states of occupancy. Some photos showed the building empty and abandoned. Others showed it actively inhabited by people whose faces I did not recognize, but who appeared completely comfortable with my presence. In several photos, I appeared alongside the residents, smiling and relaxed as if we were old friends. I was wearing clothing that I owned, but did not remember purchasing. My hair was arranged in styles that I did not remember choosing. I was living a life that I could not remember living. Over the following weeks, I tried to research what I had experienced. I consulted with professors, psychiatrists, and experts in unexplained phenomena. The theories ranged from psychological dissociation to temporal anomalies, to elaborate hoaxes designed to drive me insane. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The photographs existed. The documentation was real. According to every record I could find, I had been conducting research at the Brennan homestead for months, maintaining regular contact with residents who should have been dead for nearly a century. I tried to return to the site once more, accompanied by my thesis advisor and 2 other graduate students. We found the clearing where the cabin should have been, but it was empty. No building, no foundation stones, no evidence that anything had ever been constructed there. Dr. Hartman was concerned about my mental state and suggested that I might be experiencing some form of graduate school stress that was manifesting in elaborate fantasies. She recommended therapy and a temporary suspension of my fieldwork until I could sort out whatever psychological issues I was dealing with. But that night, alone in my apartment, I found new photographs on my camera. Images of the cabin, occupied and active, showing me having conversations with people I had never seen before. The timestamp on the photos indicated they had been taken during the exact hours when I was meeting with Dr. Hartman in her office. I was living multiple lives simultaneously, and only one of them felt real to me. I completed my thesis using the documentation I could not explain, and I graduated with highest honors for research that I could not remember conducting. My academic career was launched by work that might have been produced by someone else entirely, someone who shared my name and my life, but had experiences that I could not access. I now work as a historical researcher for the West Virginia Department of Culture and History, specializing in early 20th century settlement patterns. My colleagues consider me an expert in this field, and I have published articles based on research that I cannot recall performing. Sometimes I find notes in my own handwriting that reference interviews and site visits that I have no memory of conducting. My professional reputation is based on expertise that I apparently possess, but cannot consciously access. I have stopped trying to understand what happened to me in the Monongahela National Forest. The rational explanations are insufficient, and the irrational explanations are terrifying. I am living with the possibility that time is not linear, that reality is not singular, and that consciousness is not as unified as we assume it to be. But I continue my work because the alternative is madness. I document historical sites and write academic papers and maintain professional relationships with people who sometimes reference conversations that I cannot remember having. I am sharing this story because I need someone else to know that impossible things are possible, and that expertise can exist independently of conscious experience. Somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, there is a cabin that exists in multiple time periods simultaneously, occupied by people who know me better than I know myself. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself planning return trips to that site, using knowledge and familiarity that I cannot explain. Part of me knows exactly how to find that cabin, how to approach the residents, and how to continue research that I have apparently been conducting for much longer than I remember. That part of me is not concerned with rational explanations or academic credibility. That part of me knows that some questions can only be answered by accepting that reality is far stranger and more complex than any of us are prepared to admit. The Brennan homestead is still there, still occupied, still waiting for my next visit. And despite everything I have experienced, I know that I will return there again, whether I remember choosing to do so or not. That is the truth I learned in the Monongahela National Forest, and it is a truth that has become the foundation of a life I cannot fully remember living. My grandfather always warned our family never to fish Blood Creek after sunset. He said our bloodline owed a debt to something that lived in those waters. I thought it was just mountain superstition until the night I discovered what happens when you ignore family warnings. What I experienced changed my understanding of debt, obligation, and the price that some families pay for their survival in these mountains. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and I am 31 years old. I was born and raised in Letcher County, Kentucky, in a hollow that has been home to my family for 6 generations. The Mitchell name goes back to the 1870s in these parts, when my great-great-grandfather Silas settled here after the Civil War with nothing but a pregnant wife and a determination to carve out a life in land that nobody else wanted. Blood Creek runs through our family property, a narrow waterway that winds down from the high ridges and eventually feeds into the Cumberland River system. It earned its name from the reddish iron deposits that color the water during certain seasons, though local folklore attributes the color to more sinister origins. The creek has always been central to our family's survival, providing water for livestock, irrigation for crops, and some of the best fishing in eastern Kentucky. But it has also been the source of our family's most persistent and troubling tradition. Every generation of Mitchell men has been taught the same warning from childhood. Never fish Blood Creek after sunset. Never disturb the water during the dark hours. And never, under any circumstances, ignore the debt that our family owes to whatever lives in the deep pools where the creek bends around ancient limestone formations. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, was the keeper of our family's oral history. He knew stories that went back 5 generations, tales passed down from father to son with the solemnity of sacred obligation. According to his accounts, our family's survival in these mountains came at a price that was negotiated long before I was born. The story, as he told it, began with my great-great-grandfather Silas during his first winter on the property. The winter of 1871 was brutal, even by Appalachian standards. Snow fell early and deep, and temperatures stayed below freezing for weeks at a time. Silas and his pregnant wife Mary were facing starvation, with no neighbors close enough to provide help and no resources to get them through until spring. Desperate and facing the death of his family, Silas began fishing Blood Creek during all hours, including after dark when fishing was traditionally forbidden by local custom. The old-timers had warned him about disturbing the water after sunset, but hunger makes people ignore warnings that well-fed folk take seriously. On the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, Silas caught something that was not a fish. According to my grandfather's telling, the creature that emerged from the deep pool was ancient and hungry, something that had lived in these mountain waters since before white settlement began. It was intelligent, capable of communication, and very interested in making a bargain with the starving homesteader who had disturbed its winter rest. The deal was simple. The creature would ensure that the Mitchell family survived and prospered on this land, that our crops would grow in soil that defeated other farmers, that our livestock would thrive in conditions that killed other animals, and that we would always have enough to eat regardless of weather or economic circumstances. In return, every 3rd generation, the Mitchell family would provide an offering to maintain the agreement. Not money or possessions, but something more personal and permanent. Blood, life force, a payment that would renew the contract and ensure the creature's continued protection of our family line. My grandfather was the offering from his generation. His older brother Thomas had been selected, but Thomas died in a mining accident before the debt could be collected. This left my grandfather as the designated payment. And on his 21st birthday, he walked down to Blood Creek after midnight to honor the family obligation. He never told me exactly what happened during that encounter, but he returned changed. He was weaker physically for the rest of his life, prone to exhaustion and illness that doctors could never properly diagnose. But our family prospered in ways that seemed to defy the economic realities of rural Kentucky. Our tobacco crops yielded better than our neighbors. Our cattle stayed healthy when disease wiped out other herds. We always had enough money when others were struggling to survive. My grandfather lived to be 83, but he aged rapidly after his encounter with the creek creature. His hair went white within a year of his 21st birthday, and he developed a tremor in his hands that never went away. He spoke of feeling partially hollow, as if something essential had been removed from his body and could never be replaced. But he also spoke of the peace that came from fulfilling family obligations and ensuring the survival of future generations. The debt was paid, the contract renewed, and the Mitchell family would continue to prosper for another 3 generations. I am the 3rd generation since my grandfather's offering. I grew up knowing that my 21st birthday would bring responsibilities that I did not fully understand but could not ignore. My father, Charles Mitchell, had prepared me as best he could, explaining the family history and the nature of our obligations without going into details that might make the burden unbearable. But my grandfather died when I was 19, taking with him the specific knowledge of how the ritual was conducted and what exactly was required of the family representative. My father knew the general outline of the obligation, but lacked the precise details that had been passed down through previous generations. This left me in the position of having to honor a debt without fully understanding the terms of payment. My 21st birthday fell on September 15th, 2013. I had planned to approach the creek that night, following what little guidance my father could provide and hoping that instinct and family connection would carry me through whatever ritual was required. But life intervened in ways that seemed designed to test our family's commitment to maintaining the agreement. I had been accepted to Eastern Kentucky University and was scheduled to start classes just days after my birthday. This represented the first opportunity in 6 generations for a Mitchell to receive a college education. And my parents were adamant that I should not sacrifice that opportunity for what they had come to view as outdated superstition. They convinced me to postpone the creek ritual until Christmas break, when I would have time to properly research the family obligations and conduct whatever ceremony was required without interfering with my education. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, and I agreed to delay honoring the debt for a few months. That decision nearly destroyed our family. Within weeks of my birthday passing without payment, our luck began to change in dramatic and terrifying ways. The tobacco crop that had been our most promising in years suddenly developed a blight that wiped out 90% of our yield. Our cattle began dying from a respiratory illness that the veterinarian could not identify or treat. The well that had provided clean water for over a century ran dry without explanation. Most disturbing of all, I began experiencing dreams that were not dreams. Visions of something ancient and furious living in the deep pools of Blood Creek, something that had been patient for 21 years but was losing patience rapidly. The creature in these visions was not the benevolent protector of family folklore, but something far more dangerous and demanding. By November, I knew that I could not wait until Christmas break. The family debt was compounding with interest, and the consequences of delayed payment were escalating beyond anything our ancestors had experienced. On November 23rd, 3 days before Thanksgiving, I walked down to Blood Creek at midnight to honor the obligation that I should have fulfilled 2 months earlier. The night was cold and clear, with a full moon that turned the creek water silver, except in the deep pools where shadows gathered like living things. I brought with me the few ritual items that my grandfather had mentioned over the years. A knife that had belonged to Silas Mitchell, a leather pouch containing tobacco and salt, and a metal cup for whatever libation might be required. But I had no clear understanding of the ceremony itself, no knowledge of the words that should be spoken or the actions that should be performed. I was improvising a ritual that my family had conducted successfully for 5 generations, hoping that good intentions would compensate for poor preparation. I called out to the creek, identifying myself as Daniel Mitchell and acknowledging that I had come to honor my family's debt. For long minutes, Nothing responded except the sound of water moving over rocks and the distant calls of night birds. Then the water in the deepest pool began to move in ways that had nothing to do with current or wind. What emerged from Blood Creek was nothing like the creature of family folklore. This was not a benevolent protector that had helped our family prosper in exchange for periodic offerings. This was something ancient and alien and utterly indifferent to human welfare or survival. The creature was approximately human in size, but completely inhuman in form. Its skin was the color of old leather, covered with scales that reflected moonlight like wet stones. Its eyes were large and dark, positioned on the sides of its head like a fish, but capable of focusing forward with predatory intensity. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of water moving through deep caverns. It did not negotiate. It did not explain. It simply presented me with the terms of payment that my family had agreed to 5 generations earlier. Terms that were far more specific and demanding than anything my grandfather had ever described. The Mitchell family debt was not a simple offering of blood or life force. It was a binding contract that required the designated family member to serve as a guardian of the creek for the remainder of their natural life. To live in the water during the dark hours, to protect the creature's territory from intrusion, and to ensure that the ancient agreements with the land itself were maintained. My grandfather had not been weakened by giving up part of his life force. He had been changed by spending half of each day living underwater as something other than human. The creature explained that my delayed payment had created complications. Other families in the area had similar agreements with similar entities, and my failure to honor the Mitchell obligations on schedule had disrupted the balance of power among the various guardians of different water sources. Compensation would be required, not just the standard service obligation, but additional duties that would extend my commitment far beyond what previous generations had experienced. I tried to negotiate, to explain that I had not understood the full terms of the contract and needed time to prepare for such a dramatic change in my existence. The creature was not interested in negotiation. It had waited 21 years for payment, and it would not wait longer. But it offered me one alternative to immediate service. I could transfer the debt to another family member, someone whose life was less committed to modern obligations and who might be better suited to the requirements of guardianship. My younger brother Marcus was 19 years old, still living at home, and had always been more comfortable with the old ways than I was. The creature indicated that it would accept Marcus as payment if I could convince him to take on the obligation voluntarily. The choice was simple and horrible. Honor the debt myself and abandon my education, my plans, and my future as a normal human being. Or convince my brother to sacrifice his life for mine, condemning him to an existence that I was not willing to accept for myself. I made a choice that I will regret for the rest of my life. I told the creature that I would return the following night with my brother's consent to the transfer of obligation. It agreed to wait one more day, warning me that further delays would result in the forfeiture of our entire family line. I spent the next 24 hours convincing Marcus that he needed to honor a debt that was rightfully mine. I lied about the nature of the obligation, minimizing the personal cost and emphasizing the family tradition. I manipulated his sense of duty and his love for our parents to make him believe that accepting the guardianship was heroic rather than tragic. Marcus agreed to take on the debt because he trusted me and because he believed he was saving our family from disaster. He walked down to Blood Creek the following night with no understanding of what he was truly agreeing to do. I have not seen my brother since November 24th, 2013. Our family prospered again almost immediately after Marcus entered the creek. The blighted tobacco recovered and produced a late harvest that yielded better prices than we had ever received. The cattle recovered from their mysterious illness and multiplied rapidly. The well refilled with water that tested purer than anything in the county. But Marcus was gone, and I was responsible for his disappearance. I completed my education and found success in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Job opportunities appeared without effort. Business ventures prospered beyond reasonable expectation. I married well, built a successful career, and accumulated wealth that should have been impossible for someone from my background. All of it purchased with my brother's life and freedom. I still live on the family property, and I walk down to Blood Creek every few months to leave offerings of tobacco and salt at the edge of the deep pool where Marcus disappeared. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I see movement in the water that might be my brother performing his guardian duties. But he never acknowledges my presence, and he never emerges from the creek to visit his family or check on the people whose prosperity he purchased with his sacrifice. I am sharing this story as both confession and warning. Some family debts are real, and some traditions exist for reasons that transcend superstition. But the price of honoring those obligations can be higher than any family should be asked to pay. If you come from mountain families with old traditions and persistent warnings, do not dismiss them as folklore. And if you ever find yourself in a position to transfer family obligations to someone else, remember that the cost of your freedom will be measured in someone else's life. Marcus Mitchell disappeared into Blood Creek on November 24th, 2013. And I am the reason he is gone. That debt can never be repaid, and that guilt can never be absolved. Some choices echo through generations, and some sacrifices can never be undone. I needed to get away from everything after my divorce, so I planned a week-long solo hike through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The rhododendron thickets they call Laurel Hell seemed like the perfect place to disappear. I had no idea something was already living there, something that could perfectly mimic any sound it heard. What I experienced changed my understanding of silence, solitude, and the dangerous difference between being alone and being hunted. My name is Brittany Caldwell, and I am 34 years old. I work as a nurse in Roanoke, Virginia, and I have been hiking these mountains since college. When my marriage ended after 8 years, I could not stand the silence in our empty house anymore. Every room held conversations that would never finish, arguments that had worn grooves in the floorboards, and the particular quiet that follows when someone stops trying to make things work. I planned a solo trip into a section of the Blue Ridge that I knew from trail maintenance work years earlier. The area is not officially mapped, just old logging roads that wind into dense rhododendron tunnels where the trail becomes more of a suggestion than a path. Locals call it Laurel Hell because the growth is so thick you can get lost within 50 yards of where you started. I wanted isolation. I wanted the kind of quiet that would let me hear myself think clearly for the first time in months. I packed for 4 days, told my sister June where I was going, and drove to an unmarked parking area that serves as a trailhead for people who know it exists. The first day went perfectly. Clear weather, steady hiking, and the gradual transition from maintained trail to deer paths to barely their roots through increasingly dense vegetation. By evening, I had reached a small clearing where I set up camp between 2 birch trees, feeling proud of my navigation and grateful for the complete silence that surrounded me. That silence should have been my first warning. The woods in this area are usually full of night sounds. Owls, insects, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But as I cooked dinner on my camp stove, I became aware that the forest around me was completely quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening, but the tense quiet that happens when prey animals sense a predator nearby. I finished eating and was cleaning my cookware when I heard my name called from the darkness beyond my campfire. Britt. It was my ex-husband's voice, speaking with the exact tone he used when he was trying to apologize for something without actually saying he was sorry. The voice came from the woods, about 30 yards from my camp, but there was no way David could be here. He did not even know where I had gone, and he had never shown any interest in hiking during our entire marriage. I called out, asking who was there, but received no response. I told myself it was another camper playing a joke, or maybe a hunter who had somehow learned my name from overhearing my phone conversations at the trailhead. But the explanation felt thin, even as I tried to convince myself it was reasonable. I went to sleep uneasy, but the night passed without further incidents. The second day brought me deeper into the rhododendron thickets, where the vegetation forms natural tunnels and the world becomes a maze of green corridors. This is challenging hiking under the best circumstances, requiring constant attention to route finding and a willingness to backtrack when passages dead end into impenetrable walls of branches. But something was wrong with the acoustics in these thickets. Sounds were not behaving the way they should in a natural environment. I would hear a bird call from my right, and then the exact same call would repeat from my left with identical timing and pitch, as if it were an echo that had somehow changed direction. Water sounds moved without any visible stream. I would hear dripping from ahead of me, follow the sound, and then hear the same dripping pattern start up behind me in the area I had just left. The wind seemed to have seams, with gusts starting and stopping in discrete sections rather than flowing naturally through the forest. Most disturbing were the footsteps. I would hear the sound of someone walking parallel to my route, matching my pace, but staying just out of sight behind the wall of vegetation. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I changed direction, they changed direction. But when I tried to approach the source of the sounds, I found nothing but empty forest. During my lunch break, I heard my own voice call out from the thicket. "We could stay here," it said, using the exact tone and inflection I had used 2 months earlier when I was trying to convince David to try marriage counseling. The voice was mine, but I was not speaking. I was sitting alone, eating a granola bar, when my own words came back to me from the woods. That was when I realized I was not dealing with other hikers or natural acoustics. Something in these thickets was learning from me, copying the sounds I made and the voices I knew, but not quite getting them right. I decided to push for higher ground, hoping to get above the densest vegetation and find my way back to more traveled areas. But the climb toward the ridge took me through even thicker rhododendron, where the branches formed a canopy so dense that it felt like hiking through a tunnel. The voice activity intensified as I climbed. I heard my sister June calling my name. Then my mother humming a song she used to sing while doing housework. Then David again, using the pet name he had called me early in our relationship, before things went wrong. None of the voices were quite right. They had the correct words and approximately the right pitch, but they lacked the natural breath patterns and subtle imperfections that make human speech sound human. It was like listening to a very sophisticated recording device that was trying to learn how to be a person. I reached a saddle between 2 hills and made camp as the sun was setting. I chose the spot because there was clear ground and good visibility in multiple directions. I did not want to spend another night surrounded by dense vegetation where something could approach without being seen. As darkness fell, the vocal activity around my camp became constant and increasingly sophisticated. The entity, whatever it was, began combining different voices to have conversations with itself. I heard my mother and my sister discussing my hiking plans. I heard David apologizing to me in words he had never actually spoken. I heard myself agreeing to things I had never agreed to. The most disturbing moment came when I heard a child crying in the woods below my campsite. Every instinct I have as a nurse and as a human being told me to investigate, to offer help to someone who sounded lost and frightened. But I had learned enough about this entity to know that the crying was just another mimicry, another attempt to manipulate me into leaving my camp and venturing into the darkness where it could approach more closely. I stayed in my tent and listened to the crying continue for over an hour, perfectly consistent in timing and pitch, never varying the way real distress would vary. It was a performance, and I was the intended audience. The third day was a race to reach the road. I abandoned my planned route and pushed directly toward the nearest service road, using compass bearings and topographic landmarks to maintain direction through terrain that seemed designed to confuse and misdirect. The entity followed me throughout the day, constantly calling my name in different voices, trying to engage me in conversation, attempting to convince me to stop and respond. But I had learned the most important rule for dealing with this phenomenon. Never answer back. Never give it new material to work with. By afternoon, I could hear it experimenting with combinations of sounds it had learned from me. My laugh mixed with David's voice. My mother's humming interrupted by my own cough. It was building a vocabulary of my life, collecting the audio signatures of my relationships and my emotions. When I finally reached the service road and got cell phone reception, I called my sister immediately. She answered with my name, and I almost hung up because for a split second, I could not tell if it was really her or another mimicry. That doubt, that moment of uncertainty about whether the people I love are real when they speak to me, has never completely gone away. I have not returned to that area. And I never will. I have not told many people about what I experienced because I know how it sounds. But I am sharing this story because I need people to understand that there are things in the deep woods that are curious about human beings in ways that are not benign. The entity in Laurel Hell was not trying to hurt me physically. It was trying to learn me, to understand how humans communicate and connect with each other. But its method of learning required studying me in isolation, keeping me separated from other people, while it practiced using their voices to manipulate my behavior. If you hike alone in remote areas, pay attention to sounds that feel wrong. If you hear voices calling your name in places where no one should know your name, do not answer. If you hear conversations that sound like people you know but seem slightly off, do not approach. And if you ever find yourself being followed by something that speaks with the voices of the people you love, remember that love does not sound perfect when it is real. The entity in Laurel Hell taught me that silence is not empty, and that being alone does not mean you are unobserved. Some forms of attention are predatory, and some kinds of interest are not safe to satisfy. The woods will always have their secrets, but some secrets are better left undiscovered. I inherited my great-aunt's mountain property in the Nantahala forest and found something buried beneath her cabin that made me understand why she lived alone for 60 years and never spoke about her childhood. Some family secrets should stay buried, but once you know the truth about what your ancestors did to survive, you cannot pretend ignorance anymore. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family and the price some people pay for prosperity. My name is James Patterson, and I am 38 years old. I work as a civil engineer in Asheville, North Carolina, and I thought I knew my family history until my great-aunt Mabel died at 91 and left me her property in the mountains near Robbinsville. The inheritance came as a surprise because I had only met her 3 times in my entire life. and she had never shown any particular interest in maintaining family relationships. Aunt Mabel lived alone on 40 acres of heavily wooded land that had been in our family since the 1920s. The property included a small cabin that she had built herself in the 1960s, using techniques and materials that made the structure seem much older than it actually was. She had no electricity, no running water, and no telephone. She grew her own food, hunted for meat, and traded occasionally with neighbors for supplies she could not produce herself. Most of our family considered her eccentric at best and possibly mentally ill at worst. She had never married, never held a regular job, and never explained why she chose to live in such complete isolation. The few times I had visited as a child, she had been polite but distant, treating us like strangers who happened to share her last name. When she died of a heart attack in her sleep, I was the only family member willing to deal with the property. Everyone else wanted to sell it immediately to developers who were buying mountain land for vacation homes. But something about the place drew me back, and I decided to spend a few weeks there before making any permanent decisions. The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a main room, a small kitchen, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. The construction was solid and practical, built to last through mountain winters and summer storms. But there were architectural details that seemed strange for a structure built in the 1960s. The foundation was much more extensive than necessary for a cabin of this size. Stone walls extended deep into the ground, creating what appeared to be a partial basement or root cellar beneath the main structure. The floor of the cabin was raised several feet above ground level, supported by heavy timber beams that seemed designed to bear much more weight than a simple mountain cabin would require. Most peculiar was a trap door in the kitchen floor that was secured with a modern padlock, but showed evidence of much older hardware that had been removed and replaced multiple times over the decades. When I asked neighbors about the property's history, they became evasive and suggested I speak with Mabel's estate attorney about any questions regarding the land. The attorney, an elderly man named Robert Caldwell, who had known Mabel for over 30 years, was equally unhelpful. He indicated that Mabel had left specific instructions about the property, but declined to share the details until I had spent at least 2 weeks living there. She wanted me to understand the place before making any decisions about its future. I thought this was typical mountain eccentricity until I began finding things that suggested the property had a history that extended far beyond my aunt's 60 years of residence. While cleaning out a storage shed, I discovered tools and equipment that dated to the early 20th century. Hand-forged farming implements, oil lamps with glass chimneys blackened by decades of use, and wooden boxes filled with household items that looked like they belonged in a museum of Appalachian life. But more disturbing were the children's belongings mixed in with these antiques. Shoes in various sizes, clothing that had been carefully mended and remended, toys carved from wood with initials scratched into them. The quantity suggested that many children had lived on this property over an extended period of time, which contradicted everything I knew about my family history. According to our family records, my great-great-grandparents had homesteaded this land in 1923 with their 2 children, including my great-grandfather, Samuel Patterson. There had never been any mention of other children living on the property, and the isolated location made it unlikely that neighborhood children would have left belongings here. I decided to investigate the locked trapdoor in the kitchen floor. The padlock was modern, but the iron hardware around it showed signs of being much older, with layers of paint and rust that suggested it had been secured and reopened many times over the decades. Using bolt cutters, I removed the padlock and lifted the trapdoor. Below was a set of stone steps leading down into a chamber that was much larger and more complex than any root cellar I had ever seen. The underground space had been carved directly into the bedrock and reinforced with fitted stone walls. It consisted of multiple rooms connected by narrow passages, all illuminated by whatever daylight filtered down through the trapdoor opening. The construction was professional quality, requiring engineering knowledge and significant labor to complete. But the purpose of these rooms became horrifyingly clear as I explored them. The largest chamber contained the remains of primitive sleeping areas. Straw mattresses arranged in rows, with iron rings set into the stone walls at intervals that suggested restraints. A wooden bucket in one corner and a crude drainage system indicated that people had been held here for extended periods without access to proper sanitation. The walls were covered with names and dates carved into the stone. Dozens of children's names, with ages that ranged from 6 to 15, and dates spanning from the 1920s through the 1940s. Some entries included hometown information, indicating that these children had come from communities throughout western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. In a smaller adjacent room, I found evidence of systematic record-keeping. Wooden boxes contained ledgers, written in careful handwriting, that documented the placement of children with families throughout the region. The ledgers recorded names, ages, physical descriptions, and payment amounts for what appeared to be a trafficking operation that had operated for over 20 years. The records showed that my great-great-grandparents had not been simple homesteaders struggling to survive in the mountains. They had been operating a business that involved acquiring children from desperate families or institutions and selling them to people who wanted cheap labor or had other purposes for which they were not willing to use legal adoption processes. The operation had been sophisticated and well-connected. The ledgers referenced contacts in orphanages, poorhouses, and reform schools throughout the Southeast. There were code names for buyers and detailed notes about their preferences and requirements. Most disturbing were the margin notes that tracked which children had satisfied expectations and which had required replacement. I found correspondence that made it clear this was not a small-scale operation run by desperate people. The letters discussed shipments of 20 or more children at a time, payment schedules that involved substantial amounts of money, and coordination with similar operations in other states. My family had not been poor mountain farmers. They had been successful criminals operating a business that destroyed the lives of hundreds of children over 2 decades. The final room contained evidence of what happened to children who could not be placed successfully. A collection of small personal items, shoes, clothing, toys, that had belonged to children whose names appeared in the ledgers but had no corresponding placement records. In the corner was a pile of small bones that I did not examine closely enough to identify. But that filled me with a sick certainty about the fate of children who had become liabilities to the operation. I spent 3 days documenting everything I found before I could bring myself to contact the authorities. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but it implicated not just my ancestors, but potentially dozens of other families throughout the region who had been customers of this trafficking network. The sheriff's department treated my report seriously, but explained that the crimes I was describing had occurred so long ago that prosecution was impossible. Most of the participants were dead, and the statute of limitations had expired decades earlier. They would investigate to determine if there were any recent crimes or ongoing activities. But the historical aspects of the case would likely be referred to academic researchers rather than criminal prosecutors. The estate attorney, Mr. Caldwell, was not surprised when I told him what I had found. He explained that Mabel had discovered the underground chambers when she built her cabin in the 1960s and had spent the rest of her life trying to decide what to do with the knowledge. She had consulted with lawyers, historians, and law enforcement over the years, but had never found a way to address the crimes without destroying the lives of innocent descendants who had no connection to the trafficking operation. Mabel had chosen to live alone on the property as a kind of guardian, ensuring that the evidence was preserved but not accessible to people who might use it to harm surviving family members of both victims and perpetrators. She had hoped that someone from our family would eventually inherit the property and find a way to honor the memory of the victims without creating new victims through exposure of historical crimes. I faced an impossible choice. I could expose everything I had found, potentially bringing some measure of justice for crimes that had been hidden for decades, but also destroying the lives of people whose only crime was being descended from criminals they had never known about. Or I could follow Mabel's example and become a guardian of terrible knowledge, protecting both the victim's memory and the innocent living. I chose a middle path. I contacted historians at Western Carolina University and arranged for the evidence to be properly documented and preserved in their archives, where it could be studied by researchers but would not be accessible to the general public without appropriate academic oversight. The physical remains were turned over to anthropologists for proper burial and memorial. I donated the property to the National Forest Service with the stipulation that it be maintained as a memorial site, though the specific nature of what is being memorialized was not made public. The underground chambers were sealed, and a small marker was placed on the site identifying it as a memorial to children who died far from home in the early 20th century. I have never spoken publicly about what I found until now, and I am only sharing this story because I believe people need to understand that historical crimes do not disappear simply because time passes. The trafficking network that operated from our family property was not unique, and similar operations existed throughout Appalachian regions during the same time period. The children whose names are carved into those stone walls deserve better than they received from the world. And they deserve better than being forgotten because their suffering is inconvenient to acknowledge. But they also deserve to have their story told without creating new victims among people who bear no responsibility for historical crimes. That is the burden I inherited along with 40 acres of mountain land. And it is a burden I will carry for the rest of my life. Some family secrets should stay buried, but others should be preserved and honored, even when the truth is too difficult for public consumption. The children who suffered and died on that property finally have a memorial, and their names have been recorded in academic archives where researchers can study their lives and deaths in the context of historical child welfare practices. It is not justice, but it is acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the only form of justice that history allows us to provide. Every October, our small mountain community in North Georgia holds the Harvest Moon Festival, a tradition that goes back generations. Last year, I discovered that some traditions have been twisted into something far more sinister, and that our harvest celebration was feeding something ancient and hungry. What I learned cost me everything I loved about the place where I grew up, but it also saved my life. My name is Nicole Washington, and I am 29 years old. I was born and raised in Cedar Hollow, a community of about 200 people in the Chattahoochee National Forest. Our Harvest Moon Festival has always been the heart of our community life, bringing together every family for 3 days of celebration each October when the moon is full. The festival follows traditions that have been passed down for generations. We display the best crops from each farm, hold competitions for preserved foods and crafts, and gather for music and dancing that lasts until dawn. The celebration culminates with the selection of a harvest queen, a young woman who receives gifts from every family and leads the final procession that officially closes the festival. I had participated in this celebration my entire life and always viewed it as something beautiful and sacred. It made me proud of our community and confident that Cedar Hollow was a special place worth preserving. That changed last October when I was selected as Harvest Queen. The selection is made by 7 community elders who meet privately on the first night and announce their choice on the second day. I was surprised to be chosen instead of Sarah Mitchell, whose family owns the largest farm and who had been preparing for the role her entire life. But the announcement was met with genuine enthusiasm from the community. The first sign that something was wrong came when my grandmother pulled me aside after the ceremony. She was frightened, which was impossible because my grandmother had never been afraid of anything in her 78 years of mountain life. She told me that being Harvest Queen was both a great honor and a terrible responsibility, and that I needed to understand what the role truly meant. When I asked her to explain, she became evasive and said the other elders would provide the necessary information when the time was right. But she made me promise that if I ever felt uncomfortable with what was expected of me, I should come to her immediately. That evening, Elder Morrison asked me to attend a private meeting with the community leaders. He explained that there were aspects of the Harvest Queen role that could not be discussed publicly, and that I needed to be briefed on my responsibilities for the final ceremony. The meeting took place in the basement of the Methodist Church, in a room I had never seen before despite attending services there my entire life. The space was much older than the church above it, with stone walls and timber beams that looked ancient. The 7 elders explained that the Harvest Moon Festival served purposes beyond community celebration. The ceremony was designed to maintain an agreement that our ancestors had made with entities that controlled the prosperity of our land and the safety of our people. According to their account, the original settlers had found land that was already occupied by something that was not human, but not hostile to human presence. These entities were ancient and powerful, but willing to coexist under specific conditions that required annual tribute in the form of recognition, respect, and periodic offerings. The Harvest Queen role was central to this arrangement. The selected woman served as the community's representative in renewing the annual agreement with the entities that protected our land. This involved participating in a ceremony that was much older and more complex than the public procession. When I asked for specific details, the elders became evasive. They assured me that the ceremony was perfectly safe when conducted properly, emphasizing that my participation was voluntary, but making it clear that refusing would have serious consequences for the entire community. Elder Morrison showed me a ledger documenting harvest yields, livestock survival rates, and community health statistics for 50 years. The data showed that years when the festival was conducted properly were dramatically more prosperous than years when it was canceled or abbreviated. But I noticed something the elders did not mention. In years when the festival was conducted properly, there was always one name missing from the community roster the following year. A young woman who had served as Harvest Queen and then disappeared, with explanations about moving away to pursue opportunities in larger cities. When I asked about this pattern, they explained that serving as Harvest Queen was often transformative, inspiring women to explore horizons beyond our small community. They viewed this as natural evidence that the ceremony empowered women rather than limiting them. Their explanations felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect that the fate of former Harvest Queens was not as benign as they claimed. I asked for time to consider their proposal, and they agreed to give me until the following evening. They warned that rejecting the role would require selecting a replacement so late in the festival, which might result in a less effective ceremony than the community needed. That night, I visited my grandmother and told her everything. She listened without surprise, confirming that she had known about the true nature of the festival all along. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She told me she had served as Harvest Queen in 1965 and that the experience had changed her life in ways she had never been able to discuss. The mountain ceremony involved more than symbolic offerings. The entities demanded substantial tribute that could only be provided by a young woman representing the community's most precious resource. The Harvest Queens did not move away to distant cities. They were consumed by the entities during the ceremony, their life force absorbed as payment for another year of prosperity and protection. My grandmother had survived only because she had been pregnant at the time, though she had not known this when chosen. The entities had rejected her as an offering because she carried new life, making her unsuitable for their purposes. She had been returned with instructions to never speak about what she witnessed and to ensure future ceremonies were conducted properly. She had spent 60 years knowing that our community's prosperity was purchased with the lives of young women, and that she had been complicit in maintaining a system that murdered people in the name of tradition. I realized I faced a choice between becoming a victim or finding a way to expose and destroy the system, but challenging the elders directly would likely result in my death being disguised as an accident. I decided to participate in the ceremony with preparations the elders did not know about. I contacted a friend who worked for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and arranged for law enforcement to be positioned near the ceremony site. I also left detailed documentation with my grandmother, requesting that she ensure the truth was revealed if I did not return. The mountain ceremony took place in a clearing I had never seen before, despite growing up in these hills. The location felt wrong in ways I cannot describe, as if natural laws did not apply there. The entities that appeared were physical beings, ancient and alien, that had been living in these mountains since before human settlement. They communicated by speaking directly into minds rather than through normal hearing. The ceremony was exactly what my grandmother had described. The elders offered me as tribute to ensure another year of prosperity, and the entities prepared to accept the sacrifice that had been promised. But the law enforcement officers intervened before the ceremony could be completed. The confrontation revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had controlled our community for over a century. 7 elders were arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. Investigations revealed evidence of dozens of previous killings dating back generations. The entities disappeared during the chaos, retreating to whatever deep places had sheltered them for millennia. Cedar Hollow was destroyed by the exposure of its darkest secret. Families moved away, rather than face the stigma of having participated in or benefited from ritualized murder. The land lost its supernatural fertility, and remaining residents struggled with crop failures that made continued habitation impractical. I survived, but lost everything I had ever known about my home. The place where I had planned to spend my entire life became uninhabitable, not because of supernatural retaliation, but because the community could not survive the truth about what it had been built on. I now live in Atlanta and work as an advocate for victims of ritualized abuse. I share my story because similar situations exist in isolated communities throughout Appalachian regions. Traditional practices that seem harmless may conceal systems of exploitation and violence that have persisted for generations. Communities that appear to be thriving may be sustained by sacrifices hidden from outsiders and rationalized by people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The Harvest Moon Festival was not a celebration of community values. It was a murder ritual disguised as cultural tradition. If you encounter communities with secretive traditions or unexplained patterns of disappearances, trust your instincts and seek help from outside authorities. Some secrets are kept to protect people, but others are kept because exposing them would reveal ongoing crimes. Cedar Hollow is empty now, and the entities that once protected it have retreated to places where humans cannot easily follow. The mountain clearing where generations of young women died is overgrown with vegetation that will not support normal plant life. as if the land remembers what happened there. That is the truth I learned about my community, and it cost everything to reveal. But some truths are worth telling regardless of the price, and some traditions deserve to be destroyed rather than preserved.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the most remote and unforgiving corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where civilization fades and something far more primitive takes hold. In this episode, we will uncover 8 deeply disturbing encounters with feral human beings who have abandoned society and embraced a savage existence in the ancient wilderness. These are not legends or folklore, but documented testimonies from geologists, park rangers, hunters, and researchers who stumbled upon communities of people living in ways that defy modern understanding. Each account has been meticulously verified through cross-referenced reports, physical evidence, and witness testimonies that paint a horrifying picture of human devolution in America's last wild places. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered, but the core experiences remain untouched in all their terrifying authenticity. These survivors have chosen to share their stories as warnings to others who might venture too deep into the mountains where humanity ends and something else begins. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the files that others tried to bury. Now let us begin our descent into the heart of Appalachian darkness. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been a park ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 11 years. In that time, I have seen my fair share of dangerous wildlife, lost hikers, and emergency rescues. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during the 3rd week of September 2022. What I am about to tell you goes against every official report I filed, every statement I gave to my supervisors, and every rational explanation I once believed about what lives in these ancient mountains. It started with the missing hikers. 3 separate incidents in 4 days, all along the same general area near Cataract Falls, about 7 miles into the backcountry. The first was Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old from Nashville who had been backpacking solo. Her tent was found intact, sleeping bag still rolled out, but her hiking boots were missing and her food cache had been completely emptied. Not by bears, though. Bears leave distinct claw marks and tear packaging apart. This was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The second disappearance was more troubling. 2 college students from Georgia, Tyler and Amanda, had been camping together near the old logging road that cuts through Pine Creek Ridge. Their campsite looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of dinner. Canned beans still warm in the pot, flashlights still on, but both their packs were gone and their hiking poles had been snapped in half and arranged in a peculiar pattern around their extinguished fire. The pattern looked almost ritualistic, like some kind of warning or territorial marker. By the time we found the 3rd site, I knew we were dealing with something beyond standard search and rescue protocols. An experienced outdoorsman named Frank Costello had been hiking the same trail system for 20 years. He knew these mountains better than most of the seasonal rangers. His campsite was completely destroyed, not damaged, but systematically dismantled. Every piece of equipment had been taken apart, sorted, and arranged in neat piles based on material. Metal items in one stack, synthetic fabrics in another, food containers in a third. It was the work of intelligence, not animal instinct. My supervisor assigned me to lead a 3-day search operation with 2 other rangers, hoping to find some trace of the missing hikers before the weather turned. We packed enough supplies for 5 days just in case, and set out before dawn on Thursday morning. The plan was to follow the main trail system, then branch out into the more remote areas where the disappearances had occurred. The first day yielded nothing unusual. We found the abandoned campsites I had already documented, took additional photographs, and searched the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or direction of travel. The forest felt different than usual, though. Too quiet. In 11 years of working these trails, I had never hiked for hours without hearing the standard sounds of wildlife. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. That evening, we made camp at a designated backcountry site about 4 miles from the last known location of Frank Costello. As we prepared dinner, Ranger Phillips mentioned something that had been bothering him all day. He had been finding tracks, but they did not match any known wildlife in the area. They were roughly human-sized, but the gait pattern was wrong. Too long between steps, and the impression showed toes that were unusually spread, like someone who had never worn shoes. Around midnight, we heard the first call. It started as what sounded like a woman crying for help, echoing from somewhere deep in the valley below our campsite. We immediately grabbed our gear and headed toward the sound, following standard rescue protocols. But as we got closer, the voice changed. It became deeper, more guttural, and the words became less distinct. By the time we reached the area where the sound had originated, there was only silence. That was when Phillips found the first trail marker. Not an official Park Service marker, but something else entirely. A deer skull mounted on a broken tree branch, positioned at eye level and facing directly back toward our campsite. The bone had been stripped completely clean, but there were tool marks on it. Deliberate scraping and cutting that suggested the use of crude but effective implements. We followed a series of these markers for over a mile, each one more elaborate than the last. Animal bones arranged in specific patterns, strips of fabric that clearly came from hiking gear, and eventually pieces of human clothing hung from branches like primitive flags. The trail led us deeper into terrain that was not marked on any of our maps, through dense undergrowth that showed clear signs of regular travel. The path ended at a clearing that should not have existed. In the center was what I can only describe as a processing site. Large, flat rocks arranged in a circle, stained dark with what was unmistakably blood. Animal hides stretched between wooden frames made from saplings. Piles of bones sorted by type and size. And hanging from a makeshift rack constructed of branches and rope, strips of meat in various stages of drying. But it was the smell that confirmed our worst fears. Not just the metallic scent of blood or the gamey odor of wild meat. There was something else underneath it all, something sweet and wrong that made my stomach turn. I had smelled it once before, during a recovery operation where we found a hiker who had been dead for over a week. Human decomposition has a distinct odor that you never forget. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Phillips grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in our flashlight beams. They were human in shape, but wrong in every other way. Gaunt and pale, with long matted hair and movements that were too fluid, too predatory. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, and they carried crude weapons made from sharpened sticks and metal scavenged from camping gear. The largest of the 3 stepped forward and made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization. It was clearly some form of communication, but unlike any language I had ever heard. The other 2 responded in kind, and they began to circle our position with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. We backed toward the trail we had followed into the clearing, but one of the creatures moved to block our path. Up close, I could see that it had once been human, but years of living wild had changed it in fundamental ways. Its teeth were filed to points, its fingernails grown long and sharp, and its skin was covered in scars and primitive tattoos made from ash and blood. The standoff lasted only seconds before training took over. We fired our service weapons into the air, hoping to scare them off without causing injury. The sound echoed through the forest, and the creatures immediately scattered, disappearing into the underbrush with inhuman speed and silence. We ran. For over 2 miles, we ran through terrain that seemed designed to slow us down and separate us. Fallen logs blocked our path at regular intervals, forcing us to climb over or go around. Low-hanging branches created natural barriers that had to be navigated carefully in the dark. And all around us, we could hear them moving through the forest, staying parallel to our position but never quite visible. By the time we reached our original campsite, dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. We packed our gear in record time and hiked directly back to the ranger station, where I immediately contacted my supervisor and the county sheriff. The official report documented our discovery of what we termed an illegal hunting camp and possible poaching operation. No mention was made of the creatures we encountered or the clear evidence of human predation we had witnessed. 2 weeks later, a joint operation between Park Service personnel and federal agents returned to the site. They found nothing. The clearing had been abandoned, all evidence removed, and the trail markers had been taken down. According to the official summary, we had likely encountered a group of individuals living illegally within park boundaries who had fled when discovered. But I know what I saw. And 6 months later, when the disappearances started again, this time near Cades Cove, I was not surprised. I requested a transfer to a different park and was granted approval within 30 days. My replacement, a young ranger named Matthews, lasted exactly 3 weeks before requesting his own transfer. He never told me what he encountered, but I recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted expression I see in my own reflection every morning. The official position of the National Park Service is that no feral human populations exist within protected boundaries. But late at night, when I am alone with my thoughts, I remember the intelligence behind those pale eyes and the calculated way they moved through their territory. Whatever they once were, they had adapted to life in the deep wilderness in ways that made them more dangerous than any natural predator. I still work as a park ranger, but now in Colorado, where the mountains are younger and the forests hold different secrets. Sometimes, though, I get calls from colleagues still working in the Smokies. They tell me about hikers who vanish without explanation, about campsites found empty with all the food missing, about sounds in the night that do not match any known wildlife. And I tell them what my supervisor told me after I filed my original report. Some things are better left unreported, and some trails are better left unfollowed. The Smoky Mountains have been home to humans for thousands of years, but not all of them chose to remain part of civilization. My name is Marcus Thompson, and if you are listening to this, let me say one thing up front. I am not a storyteller. I am a geologist. That means I spend my days squinting at rocky outcrops, taking core samples and running numbers on mineral content, not spinning ghost stories around the campfire. But every so often, the world reminds you that numbers cannot explain everything. Some things belong to the wilderness, and the Appalachians, ancient, lonely, and largely untamed, hide things no field manual will tell you about. It was a late October morning in 2023 when I hiked up into the Blue Ridge on assignment. My company had been contracted to survey an area for a possible pipeline expansion, and my section included a stretch of remote, rocky terrain near the Carolina border. The locals in the neighboring town of Elmswood said little about the area except that it was best left undisturbed. Some joked about mountain lions, others about something older. I tuned it all out. I had data to collect. The first thing you have to understand about this place is the silence. I do not mean the quiet of a city park or even the hush after fresh snowfall. I mean the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you aware of your own breathing. The wind in these mountains moves in odd currents. Sometimes a gentle sigh, sometimes a cold hand up the back of your neck. The trees here grow thick and close, their roots so tangled in the old rock that when you try to cut a trail, you end up walking in circles. That morning, the autumn leaves had already fallen in great rust-red and gold mats, muffling even my own footsteps. The initial part of my hike was routine. I checked coordinates, marked outcrops, and documented a few minor landslides. About 3 miles from the main road, past an abandoned fire tower, the ground pitched downward without warning. The soil here breaks into shelves, scarred by centuries of frost and flood. My boots crunched over broken stones peppered with white bleached animal bones, deer, rabbit, raccoon, and things I could not immediately name. Then I found the entrance. It was almost by accident. The map in my hand showed a cluster of limestone shortcuts, but it did not mark this. A slit in the hill about 5 feet high and 3 feet across, half concealed by blackberry thicket and loose scree. At first I thought it was just a failed fox den, but something about the geometry, deliberate, almost architectural, caught my attention. I set down my pack, flicked on my headlamp, and squeezed inside. Inside, the cave air was heavy, the temperature instantly dropping several degrees. The beam of my flashlight swept over rock walls mottled with veins of white and rusty orange calcite. About 20 feet in, the passage widened unexpectedly. A natural chamber maybe 15 feet across, domed overhead. Something scuttled in the darkness. I froze, breath clouding in the sudden chill. That was when I noticed 2 things at once. First, the scent. It was not an animal smell per se. It was wet earth, sweat, something raw and unnatural like rust and wild onions. Second, the marks. At first I thought they were petroglyphs, marks left by ancient hands, their precise meaning lost to time. But the patterns were crude, yet fresh. Long parallel scratches, shallow at either end, scored deeply into the limestone at odd intervals. There were also smudges, ashy, greasy fingerprints, and 4 old, blood-darkened handprints spidered across the wall above a nest of moss and animal pelts. I felt real unease for the first time. Years of fieldwork have taught me what is and is not a bear, a wildcat, or a trespassing scavenger. But nothing I knew lined up with what I saw here. The nest, if you could call it that, was ringed not only with tufts of dry grass and leaves, but with carefully arranged bones, most of them animal, but some plainly horrifyingly human. Fingers, a jawbone, what looked like several molars embedded in a chunk of weathered gum. My rational mind insisted I was witnessing the detritus of some deranged squatter. Maybe a small-time cult or someone hiding from the world and sinking into madness. But then I heard the breathing. It came from deeper in the cave, a slow, laboring draw of air, so faint I almost missed it. My muscles locked, time stretched out. Then deliberately I stepped back, headlamp swinging, heart kicking a painful rhythm in my chest. That was when the thing moved. The barest shuffle, then a soft grunt, not animal, not quite human. My beam caught on an eye, not the red shine of a deer nor the pale flicker of a raccoon. This was a wet, milky orb, blinkless, socketed in a gaunt, angular face streaked with dirt and tangled black hair. Its lips thinned over oversized teeth, fragments of something soft and pink hanging from its mouth. I stifled a gasp. My mind, despite everything, tried to negotiate. This was a person, after all. A desperate, starved hermit. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there? Do you need help?" My words barely echoed, dissolving in the humid dark. The being clicked its tongue rapidly, a staccato rhythm echoing against stone, its nostrils widening as if to scent me. It ducked low, frog-like, impossibly fast, hands touching the dirt as if ready to launch forward. I retreated several steps, pulse hammering in my ears. I remembered what my local contact, Joe, 60-something, lived his whole life in Elmswood, told me before I left. If you hear whistling or see shapes watching you from the tree line, do not linger, do not stare, do not try to help. I flicked my headlamp off for an instant, willing my body to quiet. When I turned it back on, the thing had crept closer, almost at the edge of the light. I could make out a twisted, splayed body, long limbs, muddy fingers, ribs showing through smudged skin. No clothes except a ragged sheet or pelt knotted at the waist. It crawled like a spider. Suddenly it screamed. The sound was nothing like a human. It started deep in the chest, then rose, ululating, hitting an octave that sent birds fleeing from trees outside. My ears rang. Instinct took over and I ran. I stumbled, lost my balance, bashed my shoulder bloody against a stone outcropping, but somehow clawed my way into the open air. Adrenaline made everything vivid. The shock of sunlight, the hiss of wind in brittle grass, the taste of bile in my throat. As I staggered back onto the trail, I heard something shuffle behind me, then impossibly a faint, mocking whistle. The same pattern I had tapped on rock as a child when I was scared of the dark. The thing was mimicking me. I ran until my legs gave out. Every bush and shadow seemed to breathe, and I found myself constantly glancing back, half convinced I was being followed. I reached half a mile down the trail before collapsing in the dry leaves. Only then, shaking, did I check my phone. No bars, no GPS signal. I forced myself to keep moving, panic rising afresh with every imagined footfall, every twig snap. Eventually, numb with fatigue, I reached my car as late afternoon light poured sideways across the mountain. I fumbled my keys, hands shaking, and started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, I caught a flicker at the edge of the woods, the shadow of something long-limbed just out of sight. I never went back. The next day, the company called. The survey was canceled, nothing further needed at my site. I told them someone was living in that cave, that it was not safe. The words felt weak, like something I should have forgotten after a sleepless night, but they have not left me. Weeks passed and I tried to forget, to rationalize. But every now and then I would get a text or call from colleagues assigned further down the escarpment. Small things at first. Missing equipment, butchered kits, GPS units ruined or stolen, weird scratches found on vehicles. Months later, Joe called me, voice hollow. "Listen, Marcus," he whispered. "They found another cave. This time there were boot prints. Not just animal ones, but both. Big, human. But the rangers said they ended halfway up a cliff wall, like whoever made them walked into thin air." "What about the person?" He paused so long I thought the line had dropped. "Wasn't just one," he finally said. "There's more than one thing living up there. And the oldest folks say some of them have been there longer than the towns. Longer than people I hung up, cold and sweating." I moved back north a few months later and changed my cell number. But sometimes, especially on autumn nights just before dark, when the wind howls through narrow valleys, I smell that mix of wet earth, sweat, and old wild onions. And I remember the watcher in the cave, waiting for darkness to fall again. If there is a lesson, it is this: do not go inviting explanations for the unnatural. Sometimes the things that stare from the dark are not waiting to be found, and if you do find them, they will remember your face. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and I spent 3 summers working as an outdoor education counselor for Camp Wildwood, a residential program that brought inner-city kids from Baltimore and Philadelphia into the West Virginia mountains for 2 weeks of wilderness experience. I loved that job. There is something magical about watching a teenager who has never seen stars without light pollution look up at the Milky Way for the first time. or helping a kid who grew up in concrete and asphalt learn to identify bird calls and animal tracks. The summer of 2021 was my third year with the program, and I had been promoted to senior counselor, which meant I was responsible for the overnight backpacking trips with our older campers. These were 14 and 15-year-olds who had demonstrated responsibility and wilderness skills during their first week at base camp. The backpacking experience was meant to be the highlight of their stay, 3 days and 2 nights in the deep forest of Monongahela, sleeping under canvas and learning advanced survival techniques. Our group that July consisted of 8 kids and 3 counselors, including myself. The other 2 counselors were Marcus, a 24-year-old forestry student from West Virginia University, and Sarah, a 23-year-old from Pittsburgh who had been working wilderness programs for 4 years. We had been planning this particular route for months, a challenging but manageable loop trail that would take us through some of the most beautiful and remote parts of the forest. The first day went perfectly. We hiked 6 miles through mixed hardwood forest, crossed 3 streams, and made camp in a designated backcountry site near Otter Creek. The kids were excited and engaged, asking good questions about plant identification and animal behavior. After dinner, we sat around our carefully contained campfire, and I taught them some of the Cherokee legends about the mountains while Sarah helped them identify constellations. It was around 10:30 that night when we first heard the other children laughing. At first, none of us thought much of it. Summer camps use the Monongahela system regularly, and while our site was supposed to be isolated, it was possible another group was camping within a mile or 2 of our location. The laughter was distant but clear, the unmistakable sound of kids playing some kind of game in the dark. High-pitched giggles and what sounded like a group of voices calling out to each other. One of our campers, a 14-year-old named Damon from West Philadelphia, sat up in his sleeping bag and listened intently. "Miss Isabella," he whispered, "that sounds like kids our age. Can we go say hi?" I explained that wandering around in the forest at night was against safety protocols, but promised we would keep an ear out and maybe try to make contact in the morning if the other group was still in the area. The voices continued for about 20 minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always just at the edge of our hearing. What struck me as odd was the consistency of the laughter. In my experience working with teenagers, group play usually involves periods of quiet planning, arguments about rules, or natural breaks in activity. But these voices maintained the same level of excited chatter without any variation in tone or intensity. Around midnight, the sound stopped completely and we all settled in for sleep. I was sharing a tent with 2 of the girls, and Marcus and Sarah each had tents with groups of the boys. As the senior counselor, I always stayed awake longer than the others, making sure everyone was settled and listening for any sounds that might indicate wildlife in the area. I must have dozed off around 1 in the morning because the next thing I remember was being woken by Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Isabella," she whispered urgently, "you need to hear this." I checked my watch. It was 3:15. Outside our tent, I could hear voices again, but they were much closer this time. Close enough that I could make out individual words. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voices were calling out names, but they were the names of our campers. "Damon," called a young voice that sounded exactly like one of our girls. "Damon, come play with us." Then another voice, this one sounding like Marcus. "Isabella, we found something cool. Come see." But Marcus was in his tent and I could hear him breathing deeply in sleep. And the girl whose voice had called for Damon was in the tent right next to mine, also clearly asleep. Sarah grabbed my arm. "They have been doing this for 10 minutes, she whispered, using our voices, calling our names. But everyone is accounted for. I unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out into the darkness. Our campfire had died down to glowing embers, but there was enough moonlight to see the immediate area around our tents. Nothing moved. But the voices continued, now coming from multiple directions around our campsite. A perfect imitation of my own voice called out, "Marcus, can you help me with something?" Then what sounded exactly like Sarah, "Kids, wake up. We are going to see something amazing." The mimicry was flawless. Not just the tone and pitch, but speech patterns and phrases that each of us actually used. Whoever or whatever was out there had been listening to us carefully enough to reproduce our individual ways of speaking with perfect accuracy. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of investigating or trying to make contact, I woke everyone up as quietly as possible and told them we were breaking camp immediately. Some of the kids complained, thinking it was some kind of drill or test, but the fear in my voice must have convinced them this was serious. We packed our gear by flashlight in complete silence, and within 30 minutes we were hiking back toward base camp in the middle of the night. The voices followed us for the first mile, sometimes ahead of us on the trail, sometimes flanking us through the trees, always using our own voices to try to get us to respond or separate from the group. "Isabella, why are we running?" in perfect imitation of one of my campers. "Guys, wait up. I dropped something," in Sarah's exact voice, even though Sarah was right beside me. The most terrifying moment came when we reached a fork in the trail. We had taken the left path on our way in, but in the darkness and stress of the emergency evacuation, I was not entirely certain which way led back to camp. As I stood there with my map and compass trying to get our bearings, I heard my own voice calling from the right-hand path. "This way, everyone." I found the trail, but I was standing right there and I had not said a word. That was when 8-year-old Keisha, one of our younger campers who had been moved up to the advanced group because of her exceptional wilderness skills, tugged on my sleeve and whispered something that still gives me nightmares. "Miss Isabella," she said, "I can see them in the trees. They look like kids, but they are moving wrong." I followed her gaze and saw shapes moving through the forest canopy, traveling from branch to branch with fluid grace that no human child could possess. They were roughly the right size and shape to be teenagers, but they moved like primates, swinging and leaping between trees with casual ease. And they were naked, their pale skin almost luminous in the moonlight. We took the left path and kept moving, but the pursuit continued for another 2 miles. The voices became more desperate and commanding, perfect imitations of our own voices ordering us to stop, to come back, to split up so they could help us better. They knew our names, our mannerisms, even private conversations we had had earlier in the day. Around 5 in the morning, as dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, the voices finally stopped. We reached base camp exhausted and shaken, but alive and all accounted for. The camp director, a man named Robert who had been running wilderness programs for 15 years, listened to our report with growing concern. After we had all eaten breakfast and the kids were resting in their cabins, he pulled the 3 counselors aside for a private conversation. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," he told us. "We have had reports of voices in the forest, mimicry, and sightings of what people describe as feral children for the past 3 years. Always in the same general area where you were camping." He showed us a file that contained incident reports from other camps and individual hikers, all describing similar encounters with beings that appeared to be human children but displayed impossible physical abilities and predatory behavior. According to Robert, the local rangers were aware of the situation but had no effective way to address it. The creatures, whatever they were, showed clear intelligence and seemed to understand that they were being hunted. They avoided all attempts at contact or capture, and they never left physical evidence that could be documented or studied. The most disturbing part of Robert's briefing was his theory about what we were dealing with. He believed these were children who had become lost in the forest over the years and had somehow survived by adapting to a completely wild existence. Cut off from human society during critical developmental years, they had reverted to primitive behaviors while retaining enough human intelligence to be incredibly dangerous. The mimicry suggests they understand that human communication is important, he explained. But they use it as a hunting tool, the way some predators use camouflage or deception to catch prey. They have learned that humans respond to familiar voices, especially the voices of people they trust. We never went back to that area of the forest. The camp program was moved to a different section of Monongahela the following summer, and new safety protocols were established requiring all overnight trips to carry satellite communication devices and travel in larger groups. But I sometimes wonder about those children, if that is what they were. How long had they been living wild in those mountains? How many were there? And what had happened to turn them from lost children into something that hunted other humans? 6 months after our encounter, Robert called to tell me that 2 hikers had gone missing in the same area where we had been camping. Their backpacks were found hanging from tree branches 30 feet off the ground, but there was no sign of the hikers themselves. The local search and rescue team found tracks around the area, small human footprints that led into the forest canopy and disappeared. I still work with kids, but now in urban educational programs where the biggest danger is traffic and the most exotic wildlife is pigeons. Sometimes, though, when I hear children laughing and playing outside my apartment window, I find myself listening carefully to make sure the voices belong to children I can actually see. Because I learned that summer that not everything that sounds human actually is, and some of the most dangerous predators are the ones that know exactly how to sound like someone you trust. The Monongahela National Forest covers over 900,000 acres of wilderness. That is a lot of space for things to hide, and a lot of places where lost children might learn to survive in ways that change them into something else entirely. Something that remembers just enough about being human to be more dangerous than any natural predator. My name is Jackson O'Brien, and I have been bow hunting in the Pennsylvania mountains for 15 years. I grew up in Scranton, but every November since I turned 16, I have made the trip up to the Allegheny National Forest with my father and uncle for our annual deer hunt. It was a tradition that meant everything to me. 3 generations of O'Brien men carrying on something that had started with my great-grandfather, who immigrated from County Cork in 1923. The autumn of 2020 was different because it was the first year I went without my father. He had passed away from cancer that spring, and my Uncle Pat decided he was too old to make the trip anymore. But I could not break the tradition. I convinced my 2 best friends, Derek and Tommy, to join me for what I promised would be a straightforward hunting trip in an area I knew better than my own neighborhood. We arrived at our usual campsite on Sunday afternoon, the 2nd week of November. The location was perfect for deer hunting, a small clearing surrounded by oak and maple trees about 8 miles into the forest, accessible only by an old logging road that required 4-wheel drive to navigate. We had been camping there for years, and I could set up our base camp with my eyes closed. Derek was 29, a construction foreman from Philadelphia who had grown up hunting with his grandfather. Tommy was 31 like me, an Iraq veteran who worked as a mechanic and used hunting as a way to deal with what he called his demons from overseas. Both were experienced outdoorsmen who knew how to move quietly through the forest and respect the wilderness we were entering. The first sign that something was different came Monday morning. We split up before dawn to cover more ground, each taking a different section of the ridge system we had mapped out over years of hunting the area. The plan was to meet back at camp by noon to compare notes and plan the afternoon hunt. I was about 2 miles north of our campsite, sitting in a tree stand I had used many times before, when I noticed the complete absence of wildlife. In 15 years of hunting these mountains, I had never experienced such absolute silence. No bird calls, no squirrels moving through the trees, not even the sound of insects. It was like every living thing had decided to leave the area overnight. Around 10 in the morning, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the forest about 100 yards to my east, staying just at the edge of my sight. At first, I assumed it was Derek or Tommy, maybe tracking a wounded deer or exploring new territory. But the movement pattern was wrong. Too fluid, too quiet, and following no logical hunting strategy I could recognize. I climbed down from my stand and tried to get a better look, but whatever it was stayed just out of clear view. I could catch glimpses through the trees, a dark shape that seemed to be paralleling my position but maintaining its distance. When I moved toward it, it moved away. When I stopped, it stopped. It was like being shadowed by something that understood exactly what I was doing and why. By noon, neither Derek nor Tommy had returned to camp. I waited until 2 in the afternoon, then began following the trails we had agreed they would take. Derek's path led along a creek bed where the hunting was usually excellent, but I found no trace of him beyond his initial tracks leaving camp. Tommy's route took him up to a rocky outcropping that provided a good view of the entire valley, but when I reached the spot, there was no sign he had ever been there. I spent the rest of the afternoon calling their names and firing signal shots with my rifle, standard protocol when someone gets lost or separated. The sound echoed through the mountains, but there was no response. As darkness fell, I returned to camp and built up the fire, hoping they would see the light and find their way back. That was when I heard the first response to my calls. It came from the direction Derek had taken that morning. A perfect imitation of Tommy's voice calling my name. "Jackson," it called, "stay over here." I found something, but Tommy had gone in the opposite direction and the voice was coming from an area I had already searched thoroughly. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and headed toward the sound, but as I got closer, the voice moved farther away. It kept calling, sometimes using Derek's voice, sometimes Tommy's, always staying just out of sight and leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. After 20 minutes of following the voices through dense underbrush, I realized what was happening and stopped dead in my tracks. Something was using my friends' voices to lure me away from camp, and that meant either they were being controlled somehow or something else had learned to mimic their speech perfectly. Either possibility terrified me. I made it back to camp and spent the night awake by the fire, rifle across my knees, listening to the voices of my friends calling to me from multiple directions around the perimeter of the clearing. Sometimes they sounded injured, begging for help. Sometimes they sounded excited, claiming to have made a big kill and needing assistance. The mimicry was flawless, including inside jokes and personal references that only Derek and Tommy would know. Tuesday morning, I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to search for my friends, I broke camp and hiked directly back to where we had parked the truck. The entire 8-mile hike, I was followed by voices in the forest, becoming increasingly desperate and angry as they realized I was leaving. When I reached the truck, I found Derek's bow and arrow quiver hanging from the side mirror. They had not been there when we arrived Sunday, and they showed clear signs of being deliberately placed as some kind of message or trophy. The arrows had been removed, and the bowstring had been cut, making the weapon useless. I drove directly to the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks and reported my friends missing. The search and rescue operation began that afternoon and continued for 5 days. They found Tommy's backpack hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, but there was no indication of how it had gotten there or why someone would have placed it at that height. Derek's rifle was discovered 3 days later, partially buried under a pile of stones arranged in a careful pattern. The weapon had been completely disassembled, every piece separated and cleaned, then reassembled incorrectly so that it could not function. It was the work of intelligence, not animals or natural processes. The official search was called off after a week with no trace of either man beyond the abandoned equipment. The conclusion was that they had become lost or injured and succumbed to exposure, though their bodies were never recovered despite extensive efforts involving helicopters and teams of volunteers. But I knew what had really happened, and 6 months later I got confirmation. I was contacted by a park ranger named Williams, who worked in a different section of the Allegheny National Forest. She told me that hunting parties had been reporting similar experiences for the past 2 years. Voices calling from the forest using the names and speech patterns of missing members. Equipment found arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence and planning. According to Ranger Williams, there was an unofficial theory among some of the Park Service personnel that a group of people had been living deep in the forest for years, possibly generations. They had developed hunting skills that surpassed anything modern outdoorsmen possessed, and they viewed the forest as their exclusive territory. The theory suggested that these people had learned to mimic human speech as a hunting technique, the same way some predatory animals use camouflage or deception. They would isolate individual members of hunting parties, then use their voices to lure others into situations where they could be captured or killed. She also told me that the Pennsylvania Game Commission had documented a significant decline in deer populations throughout the region over the past 5 years despite reduced hunting pressure and ideal breeding conditions. Something was hunting the deer with efficiency that exceeded both natural predation and legal hunting combined. I never went back to the Allegheny Mountains. The following year I started hunting in New York State, always in groups of at least 4 people, and never in areas more than 3 miles from a main road. But sometimes when I am sitting in a tree stand waiting for deer, I hear voices calling from deeper in the forest. And sometimes those voices sound exactly like Derek and Tommy, still trying to get me to follow them into the darkness. Tommy's wife received his military death benefits after the official declaration, but Derek's family never got closure. His parents still believe he might be alive somewhere, maybe injured and unable to find his way home. I have never told them about the voices that used his speech patterns or about the bow hanging from our truck like a warning sign. The Allegheny Mountains have been home to hunters for thousands of years, long before Europeans arrived with modern weapons and hunting regulations. Some of those hunters never stopped viewing the forest as their territory, and they have developed skills that make modern outdoorsmen look like amateurs playing games in their backyard. They are still there, watching and waiting for the next group that ventures too deep into their domain. And they have learned that the most effective way to hunt humans is to use the voices of people we trust, calling to us from the darkness until we follow them far enough from safety that no one will ever find us again. My name is Ezra Mitchell, and for 7 years I lived completely off the grid in the remote foothills of eastern Kentucky. I moved there in 2015 after a messy divorce cost me my house in Louisville and left me questioning everything about modern life. I bought 43 acres of mountainous woodland for less than what most people pay for a car, built a small cabin with my own hands, and learned to live the way my great-grandfather had lived before electricity, and running water changed everything. The property was beautiful in its isolation. Dense mixed forest of oak, maple, and pine stretched in every direction, broken only by a clear creek that ran through the lower section and provided fresh water year-round. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away through difficult terrain, and the closest road that could handle a regular vehicle was a 2-mile hike down a steep trail I had cut myself. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had been seeking. A place where a man could live according to his own rules and never have to deal with the complications of modern society. I had been there about 18 months when I first noticed signs that someone else was using my property. It started small. Footprints in the soft mud near the creek that were not made by my boots. stones that had been moved from their natural positions to create what looked like primitive markers or trail signs. Areas where someone had clearly been digging, though for what purpose I could not determine. At first, I assumed it was someone passing through, maybe hunting illegally or using my land as a shortcut to somewhere else. These mountains had been home to people for centuries before property lines and deeds divided everything up, and I figured I was probably not the first person to think this particular piece of wilderness would make a good place to live. But the signs became more frequent and more deliberate. Someone was harvesting wild edibles from areas I had been managing myself, taking specific plants in a pattern that showed knowledge of sustainable gathering practices. My fish traps in the creek were being checked and sometimes emptied, but whoever was doing it knew enough to reset them properly afterward. Most disturbing of all, I started finding evidence that someone had been watching my cabin from various positions in the surrounding forest. One morning in late September, I discovered fresh footprints in the soft earth near my garden that led directly to my root cellar. I had built the cellar into the hillside behind my cabin using traditional methods I had learned from books about Appalachian homesteading. It was basically a cave lined with stone walls and wooden shelving designed to keep vegetables and preserved food at a constant cool temperature through the winter months. The footprints were human but wrong somehow. Too narrow for their length, with the toes spread wider than normal like someone who had never worn shoes. They circled the cellar entrance multiple times, and whoever had made them had spent considerable time examining the wooden door I had built to seal the entrance. That evening, I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself in the loft of my cabin with a clear view of the root cellar and settled in for what I figured might be a long night. I had my hunting rifle and a thermos of coffee prepared to wait until dawn if necessary. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement near the tree line. A figure emerged from the forest and approached the root cellar with the careful movements of someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the moonlight, I could see it was human-shaped but moved wrong, staying low to the ground and using both hands and feet to navigate the terrain. The figure spent nearly an hour examining my root cellar, running its hands over the door and walls, even pressing its face against the wood as if trying to smell what was inside. Finally, it began to dig. Not at the door, but next to the cellar, scraping at the earth with its bare hands and what looked like crude tools made from sharpened sticks and stones. I watched in growing alarm as it became clear that whoever this was intended to dig their way into my food storage. This was not casual trespassing or harmless curiosity. This was someone who knew I had food stored there and was methodically planning to take it. I made a decision that I have regretted ever since. Instead of confronting the intruder immediately, I decided to wait and see how far they would go. I told myself I was being cautious, but the truth is I was afraid. Something about the figure's movements and the deliberate way it worked suggested this was not some random vagrant or desperate local resident. This was something else entirely. The digging continued for 3 nights. Each time the figure would emerge from the forest around the same time, work for several hours, then disappear before dawn. It was making steady progress, tunneling along the stone wall of the cellar toward what I knew was the corner where I kept my winter supply of potatoes and preserved meat. On the 4th night, I decided to move my observation post closer. I climbed down from the cabin loft and positioned myself behind a large oak tree about 50 feet from the cellar. From there, I had a much clearer view of what was happening, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was not alone. There were 3 of them, all working together with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. They had tools, crude but effective implements made from metal scavenged from old farm equipment and sharpened stones, and they were not just digging randomly. They had a plan, a systematic approach to reaching my stored food that showed intelligence and long-term thinking. but it was their appearance that truly frightened me. These were human beings, but they had been changed by years of living completely wild. Their skin was darkened by dirt and weather, their hair grown long and matted with debris. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, animal hides mixed with fragments of modern fabric that had probably been scavenged from abandoned campsites or hunting cabins. Most disturbing of all was the way they communicated. They made soft grunting and clicking sounds, a primitive language that seemed to convey complex information with remarkable efficiency. They were organized, disciplined, and clearly accustomed to working as a team. By the fifth night, they had broken through into my root cellar. I watched from my hiding place as they systematically emptied my winter food supply, passing containers and bundles of preserved meat from hand to hand in a human chain that disappeared into the forest. They took everything. Months of preparation for winter gone in a single night. But they left something behind. In the morning, when I finally worked up the courage to inspect the damage, I found that they had arranged some of their own food stores in place of what they had taken. Wild tubers, nuts, dried meat that smelled wrong, and other foraged items I could not identify. It was not an equal trade by any means, but it was clearly intentional. They were not thieves in the traditional sense. They were operating according to some kind of primitive social code that I did not understand. That was when I found the bones. Hidden in the back corner of the root cellar, carefully wrapped in what looked like human hair woven into crude rope, was a collection of bones that made me physically sick. Most were animal, but some were unmistakably human. Finger bones, teeth, what looked like pieces of a human skull. And they were old, weathered smooth by years of handling. I left that same day. I packed only what I could carry in my truck and abandoned 7 years of work building a life in those mountains. I never went back, never tried to sell the property, never even contacted the local authorities. I told myself that no one would believe me, but the truth is I was terrified of what might happen if I brought outside attention to whatever was living in those hills. 6 months later, I heard from a friend in Louisville who had seen a news report about the area. A hunting party had found what authorities described as an illegal campsite on the same mountain where my property was located. The report mentioned evidence of long-term habitation, primitive shelters, and what investigators called disturbing artifacts that suggested the site had been occupied for years. The hunters who made the discovery refused to go into detail about what they had seen, but one of them was quoted as saying that whoever had been living there was not living by any rules that civilized people would recognize. The investigation was turned over to federal authorities, and as far as I know, no results were ever made public. I live in a suburban apartment now, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights and all the complications of modern life I once tried to escape. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I remember the sound of those primitive voices communicating in the darkness, and the careful way they had arranged their offerings in place of the food they took. I think about the bones wrapped in human hair, and I wonder how many other people had tried to build lives in those remote mountains over the years. How many had encountered the same beings I met, and how many had made different choices about how to handle the situation. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived and long before property deeds and modern law divided everything up into neat parcels. Some of those people never joined the modern world, never learned to live according to civilized rules, never stopped viewing the mountains as their territory and everyone else as intruders. They are still there, living according to ancient codes and defending their territory in ways that most people would never understand. And they are patient, watching and waiting for the next person who thinks they can build a life in the deep wilderness without understanding what else calls those mountains home. My name is Autumn Hayes, and I work as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service office in Little Rock, Arkansas. My specialty is severe weather prediction and storm tracking, which means I spend a lot of time in remote locations setting up monitoring equipment and collecting atmospheric data. Most of my field work is routine, but the assignment that took me into the Ozark Mountains in March of 2022 became something that no amount of scientific training could have prepared me for. I was part of a two-person team investigating an unusual weather pattern that had been developing over the Arkansas-Missouri border region. Satellite imagery showed atmospheric disturbances that did not match any known meteorological phenomena, and ground-based radar was picking up anomalies that suggested significant storm activity in areas where local weather stations were reporting clear skies. My partner was Dr. James Crawford, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arkansas who specialized in rare weather events. We drove up into the mountains on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the forest was just beginning to show the first signs of spring. The assignment was supposed to take 3 days, setting up temporary monitoring stations and collecting baseline data to help explain the satellite anomalies. The first 2 days went smoothly. We established monitoring stations at 3 different elevations, collected soil temperature readings, and documented local topographical features that might be affecting air currents. The equipment was functioning perfectly, and we were getting consistent readings that should have helped explain the unusual satellite data. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. We woke up to weather conditions that should have been impossible given the forecast. The sky was a sickly yellow-green color that I had only seen once before, during a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than anything our instruments could properly measure, and the temperature had fallen 30 degrees since midnight. Dr. Crawford checked our equipment 3 times, convinced there was a malfunction. According to every predictive model we had access to, the conditions we were experiencing could not exist in this geographic region during this time of year. The atmospheric pressure readings suggested we were in the path of a Category 3 hurricane, but we were 600 miles from the nearest ocean and 1,500 feet above sea level. Around noon, the storm hit with a ferocity that defied explanation. Winds that our anemometer measured at over 90 miles per hour before the device was destroyed by flying debris. Rain that fell so hard it was difficult to breathe if you faced into it. Lightning strikes that seemed to target metallic objects with deliberate precision, destroying 2 of our monitoring stations in the first hour. We took shelter in our research van, but it quickly became clear that the vehicle would not provide adequate protection. The storm was not moving in any predictable pattern. Instead of passing through the area like a normal weather system, it seemed to be circling our position, creating a localized vortex of destructive weather that had no basis in atmospheric science. By 3 in the afternoon, a pine tree the size of a telephone pole crashed across the road behind us, blocking our escape route. Dr. Crawford made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed a cave opening about half a mile up the mountainside and suggested we abandon the van and seek shelter there until the storm passed. We grabbed our emergency supplies and fought our way through horizontal rain and debris to reach the cave entrance. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for several people, and extended back into the mountain far enough that we could escape the noise and fury of the storm outside. But we were not alone in that cave. As we moved deeper into the darkness, our flashlights revealed clear signs of recent habitation. A fire pit with warm ashes, sleeping areas made from animal hides and moss, and crude tools fashioned from stone and scavenged metal. Most disturbing of all was the smell, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. Dr. Crawford wanted to leave immediately and find shelter elsewhere, but the storm outside had intensified to the point where venturing back into it would have been suicidal. We positioned ourselves near the cave entrance, close enough to escape quickly if necessary, but far enough inside to be protected from the weather. That was when we heard the voices. At first, they seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave system, soft murmuring that could have been wind moving through underground passages. But gradually, the sounds became more distinct, and we realized we were listening to human conversation in a language neither of us recognized. The voices grew louder and closer, and eventually we could see flickering light from deeper in the cave that suggested someone was approaching with torches or fire. Dr. Crawford and I pressed ourselves against the cave wall, hoping to remain hidden until whoever it was had passed by. What emerged from the depths of that cave still appears in my nightmares. 3 figures that had once been human but had been changed by years of living in complete isolation from civilization. They moved with the fluid grace of people who had adapted to navigating underground passages in total darkness, and their eyes reflected our flashlight beams like those of nocturnal animals. They wore clothing made from animal skins and plant fibers, primitive but expertly crafted. Their skin was pale from lack of sunlight, but tough and scarred from years of harsh living. Most unsettling of all was their reaction to our presence. They showed no surprise at finding strangers in their cave, as if they had been expecting us. The largest of the 3, a man who might have been 50 or 70 years old, stepped forward and spoke to us in perfect English. "Storm brought you here," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "Storm always brings the lost ones to us." He gestured toward the cave entrance where rain was still pounding the mountainside. "Been waiting 3 days for this one to build right." Dr. Crawford tried to explain that we were scientists conducting weather research, that we had equipment and colleagues who would be looking for us. The man listened patiently, then smiled with teeth that had been filed to sharp points. "No equipment works when the mountain calls the storm," he said. "Been calling storms for longer than your people been keeping weather records." That was when I understood that the atmospheric anomalies we had been sent to investigate were not natural phenomena. These people, whoever they were, had somehow learned to manipulate local weather patterns. The impossible storm conditions, the localized vortex, the equipment malfunctions, all of it was being controlled by human intelligence that had developed capabilities beyond anything modern science recognized. The 3 figures seemed to be debating something among themselves in their strange language, occasionally glancing at us and gesturing toward different parts of the cave. Finally, the leader turned back to us and made an offer that chilled me to the bone. "Storm will pass by morning," he said. "You can leave then. Go back to your flatland people and your machines that measure what they cannot understand. Or you can stay, learn the old ways, become part of the mountain family that keeps the ancient knowledge alive." When we indicated that we wanted to leave, his expression darkened. "Mountain does not like to let go of those who have seen too much," he warned. "Your weather machines will never work right again. Your predictions will fail when the mountain decides to call storms, and someday when you least expect it, another storm will bring you back to us." We spent that night huddled near the cave entrance, listening to the voices of the cave dwellers echoing from deep underground and watching the impossible storm continue to rage outside. By morning, the weather had cleared completely, revealing a landscape that looked like it had been hit by a tornado despite the complete absence of any rotating wind patterns. Our research van was destroyed, crushed by falling trees and battered by hailstones the size of golf balls. Most of our equipment was either missing or damaged beyond repair. We hiked back to the main road and were picked up by a search and rescue team that had been looking for us since we failed to check in the previous evening. The official report documented equipment failure due to unexpected severe weather, with no mention of the cave dwellers or their claims about controlling storms. Dr. Crawford requested a transfer to a different research, reprogram within 6 months and now works exclusively with computer models and satellite data. He has never returned to field research, but the cave dweller's warning proved accurate. Over the past 2 years, my weather predictions have become increasingly unreliable, particularly when it comes to storm systems that develop over mountainous terrain. Equipment that worked perfectly for years now malfunctions at critical moments, and I find myself unable to explain atmospheric phenomena that should be routine to analyze. 3 months ago, I was tracking a storm system that was moving toward the Ozark region when it suddenly changed direction and intensity in ways that violated every principle of meteorology I had ever learned. The storm moved in a perfect circle around a specific mountain peak, maintaining Category 2 hurricane force winds for 6 hours before dissipating completely. That mountain peak was less than 10 miles from the cave where we had taken shelter. According to satellite data, the storm should have been impossible. According to my instruments, it should not have existed at all. But according to local residents who have lived in those mountains for generations, it was just another spring storm, no different from dozens of others they had witnessed over the years. I still work as a meteorologist, but I no longer trust the science that once seemed so reliable. Weather patterns in mountainous regions follow rules that are not written in any textbook, controlled by people who have learned to work with atmospheric forces in ways that make our most advanced technology look like children's toys. The Ozark Mountains have been home to human communities for thousands of years, long before weather satellites and computer models attempted to predict and control the forces of nature. Some of those communities never forgot the old ways of reading signs in the sky and calling storms when they were needed. They are still there, living in caves and underground passages, maintaining knowledge that modern science has dismissed as impossible. And sometimes when atmospheric conditions are right, and the mountain decides it needs new members, they send storms to guide the lost ones to their door. My name is Phoenix Anderson, and I have been a professional wilderness photographer for over a decade. My specialty is capturing the raw beauty of American forests during extreme weather conditions, particularly winter scenes when the landscape transforms into something almost otherworldly. The assignment that brought me to the Appalachian Trail in February of 2023 was supposed to be the culmination of my career. A month-long photography expedition documenting winter wildlife adaptation in the most remote sections of the trail system. I had planned the trip for 2 years, studying weather patterns, wildlife migration routes, and topographical features to identify the most promising locations for capturing unique images. My route would take me through sections of the trail in Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, focusing on high-elevation areas where snow and ice create the most dramatic photographic opportunities. The expedition began in Shenandoah National Park on February 3rd, when temperatures were hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and fresh snow had fallen for 3 consecutive days. Perfect conditions for the stark, minimalist compositions I was hoping to capture. I was carrying winter camping gear rated for temperatures down to -20 degrees, plus over 40 pounds of camera equipment designed to function in extreme cold. For the first week, everything went according to plan. I captured images of frozen waterfalls, snow-laden branches creating natural sculptures, and wildlife tracks crisscrossing pristine white landscapes. The cold was brutal but manageable with proper clothing and shelter. I was averaging about 8 miles per day, stopping frequently to set up shots and waiting for optimal lighting conditions. It was during the second week, as I entered a particularly remote section of trail in West Virginia, that I began finding the unusual tracks. At first, I thought they were made by a large dog or possibly a wolf, though wolves had been extinct in this region for over a century. The prints were roughly canine in shape, but significantly larger than any domestic dog breed, with claw marks that extended unusually far from the toe pads. But as I studied the tracks more carefully, photographing them for documentation purposes, I realized they showed characteristics that did not match any known animal. The gait pattern was wrong for a quadruped, showing irregularities that suggested the creature sometimes walked on 2 legs rather than 4. The depth and distribution of weight suggested something much heavier than any dog or wolf, yet the tracks showed intelligence in their placement, deliberately avoiding areas where they would be easily spotted. I followed the tracks for over 2 miles, fascinated by the photographic opportunities they presented, and curious about what kind of animal could be creating such unusual prints. The trail led me off the main Appalachian Trail onto what appeared to be an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades. The tracks became more numerous here, joined by others that suggested I was following not just one creature, but several. The logging road ended at what had once been a clear-cut area, now partially reforested with young trees and dense underbrush. In the center of this clearing was a structure that defied immediate explanation. It appeared to be some kind of shelter, but constructed using techniques I had never seen before. Large logs had been arranged in a complex pattern, partially buried in the earth, with spaces between them filled with smaller branches, leaves, and what looked like animal fur. But it was the size of the structure that truly shocked me. This was not a simple lean-to or hunting blind. It was easily 20 feet in diameter and appeared to extend underground, as if the visible portion was only the upper level of a much larger dwelling. Most disturbing of all was the smell emanating from inside, a mixture of rotting meat, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. I approached cautiously, camera ready, professional curiosity overcoming the growing sense of unease I was feeling. The entrance to the structure was partially hidden by hanging strips of bark and animal hide, but I could see that it opened into a much larger space than the exterior suggested. I took several photographs of the construction, noting the sophisticated engineering involved in creating such a stable shelter using only natural materials. That was when I heard the breathing, deep rhythmic exhalations coming from somewhere inside the structure, too loud and too slow to be coming from any normal-sized animal. I froze, camera still raised, trying to process what I was hearing. Whatever was inside that shelter was large, and it was awake. The breathing stopped suddenly, replaced by sounds of movement, scraping and shuffling that suggested something large was rising to its feet. I backed away from the entrance, instinct screaming at me to run, but professional habit kept me focused on documenting what I was witnessing. What emerged from that winter den still haunts my nightmares. It was humanoid in basic shape, but changed by years of adaptation to extreme cold and harsh living conditions. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be a combination of matted hair and animal fur that had been deliberately attached to its skin. Its face was human enough to be recognizable, but distorted by malnutrition, frostbite damage, and primitive modifications, including filed teeth and scarification. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that terrified me most. This was not some mindless beast or person driven insane by isolation. This was a human being who had chosen to live like this, who had adapted to surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. It studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, taking in my modern winter gear, my expensive camera equipment, my obvious status as an outsider. Then it made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization, clearly some form of communication directed not at me, but at others I could not see. The response was immediate. 3 more figures emerged from the den, each showing similar adaptations to extreme cold survival, but obviously part of the same family or clan group. They moved with coordinated precision, spreading out to surround my position with the practiced efficiency of pack hunters. The largest of the group, the one who had emerged first, stepped forward and spoke to me in English that was heavily accented and difficult to understand. but unmistakably human language. "You take pictures," it said, gesturing toward my camera. "Show other people where we live." The statement was not a question, but an accusation delivered with absolute certainty. I tried to explain that I was documenting wildlife and natural landscapes, that I had no intention of revealing their location or even mentioning their existence. But even as I spoke, I realized how hollow my words sounded. I was a professional photographer, and my entire career was built on sharing images of remote wilderness areas with the outside world. "Wintertime," the creature continued, "nobody comes to mountain. We sleep, save energy, wait for warm time. You bring other people, make us move again. Always moving, always hiding, never safe." That was when I understood what I was looking at. These were not people who had recently become lost or abandoned civilization. This was a family that had been living wild for generations, adapting to seasonal patterns that included winter hibernation-like behavior that allowed them to survive in conditions that would kill anyone unprepared for the extreme cold. The smaller figures were children, I realized, though their exact ages were impossible to determine due to their primitive lifestyle and adaptive modifications. They watched me with the same intelligent wariness as the adults, clearly understanding the threat that my presence represented to their survival. "Camera," the leader demanded, holding out a hand that was more claw than finger. "Give pictures." I had two choices: comply with their demands and lose weeks of work, or attempt to escape with my equipment and probably die in the process. These people had survived in conditions that challenged every limit of human endurance, and they knew this terrain better than any modern outdoorsman ever could. I handed over my camera memory cards, watching as the leader examined them briefly before passing them to one of the others, who disappeared back into the den. "We keep pictures," he said. "You go away. Never come back. Never tell people about Mountain Family." The message was delivered without obvious threat, but the implications were clear. They had dealt with unwanted discovery before, and they had methods for ensuring their continued secrecy. I was being allowed to leave because cooperation was preferable to the alternatives, but that cooperation was not negotiable. I left immediately, hiking back to the main trail and gathering darkness without stopping to set up camp. The temperature dropped to -5 degrees that night, and I barely survived despite having equipment rated for extreme cold. These people were living through conditions that nearly killed me even with modern winter survival gear. I completed my photography expedition but never developed or published any of the images that might have revealed the location of the winter den. The memory cards I had surrendered contained weeks of work, including some of the best winter wilderness photographs I had ever captured. But I never attempted to retrieve them or return to the area. 6 months later, I read a news report about search and rescue operations in the same area of West Virginia where I had encountered the hibernating family. 3 separate hiking parties had reported equipment theft and what they described as stalking behavior by unknown individuals. Local authorities concluded that the incidents were probably the work of drug manufacturers using remote locations for illegal operations. But I knew better. The Mountain Family was protecting their territory during the active season, using techniques that kept them hidden while discouraging others from exploring too deeply into their domain. They were not criminals or madmen, but survivors who had learned to live according to natural patterns that most people had forgotten centuries ago. I still work as a wilderness photographer, but I no longer seek out the most remote and extreme locations. I have learned that some places are meant to remain hidden, and some adaptations to harsh environments come at costs that civilized people cannot imagine. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, including people who chose to remain wild when others moved toward civilization. They are still there, following seasonal patterns that include winter dormancy periods that allow them to survive conditions that would kill most modern humans. They are patient, intelligent, and absolutely committed to remaining hidden from a world that would either exploit them or try to save them from a life they have chosen. And they have learned that the best way to maintain their secrecy is to ensure that anyone who discovers them understands the importance of keeping that discovery private. My name is River Blackwood, and I have spent the last 17 years working as a forestry specialist for the United States Forest Service. My job involves surveying remote woodland areas, documenting biodiversity, and assessing the health of old-growth forest systems that have remained largely untouched by human development. It is work that has taken me into some of the most pristine and isolated wilderness areas in the southeastern United States, places where the trees have been growing undisturbed for centuries. In October of 2021, I was assigned to conduct a comprehensive survey of an old-growth section of Cherokee National Forest that had been designated for potential inclusion in a protected wilderness area. The site was located in a remote valley approximately 15 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, accessible only by hiking trails that had not been maintained for over a decade. The assignment was supposed to take 1 week, documenting tree species, measuring trunk diameters, and photographing unusual specimens for the official report. I had completed similar surveys dozens of times before, and this particular location had been recommended by my supervisor as one of the most spectacular examples of virgin forest remaining in North Carolina. What made this forest different from other old-growth areas I had surveyed was the sheer age and size of the trees. Some of the chestnut oaks and tulip poplars were clearly over 400 years old, with trunk diameters exceeding 6 feet. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight that felt ancient and primordial. But it was the silence that first made me uneasy. In 17 years of forest work, I had never experienced such complete absence of wildlife sounds. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. The forest felt empty in a way that violated everything I knew about healthy ecosystem dynamics. On my second day in the area, I began finding the markings. At first, I thought they were natural scarring from lightning strikes or disease, but closer examination revealed deliberate patterns carved into the bark of specific trees. The marks were old, weathered by years of exposure, but clearly made by tools rather than natural processes. The markings appeared to be territorial markers of some kind, carved at precise intervals along what seemed to be established trails through the forest. Each marked tree displayed the same symbol, a spiral pattern that started small at the base and grew larger as it wound upward around the trunk. Following these trail markers led me deeper into the forest than my original survey area required. But scientific curiosity compelled me to document what appeared to be evidence of historical human habitation in an area that was supposed to be pristine wilderness. The trail markers led to a clearing that should not have existed. According to topographical maps and aerial photography, this section of forest was continuous canopy with no natural openings. But there it was, a perfectly circular clearing about 200 feet in diameter, completely hidden from above by an interwoven canopy of branches that had been deliberately trained to grow together. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied every principle of forest conservation I had been trained to uphold. It was a dwelling built entirely from living trees, their trunks and branches shaped and guided over years to create walls, roof, and floor without killing the trees themselves. The structure was still alive, still growing, with leaves and new growth emerging from every surface. The craftsmanship was beyond anything I had ever seen. Whoever had created this living building possessed knowledge of tree biology and growth patterns that exceeded anything taught in modern forestry programs. They had convinced dozens of trees to grow in precise directions, their branches interweaving to create spaces that were both architecturally sound and biologically healthy. But the dwelling was not empty. As I approached to examine the construction more closely, I realized that people were living inside the treehouse. I could see movement through gaps in the living walls and smell wood smoke from a fire that must have been burning somewhere within the structure. I called out, identifying myself as a Forest Service employee and explaining that I was conducting a routine survey. The response was immediate and terrifying. The forest around me suddenly exploded with movement as figures emerged from camouflaged positions I had not even noticed. They had been watching me since I entered the clearing, possibly since I first found the trail markers. There were at least a dozen of them, men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothing made from forest materials and moving with the fluid grace of people who had spent their entire lives in the wilderness. But what struck me most was their appearance. These were not primitive people struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They were healthy, well-nourished, and clearly thriving in their forest environment. Their skin was darkened by sun and weather, their hair was long and adorned with feathers and plant materials. But their eyes showed intelligence and organization that suggested a sophisticated society. The apparent leader of the group was a woman who might have been 60 years old, with silver hair braided with vines and wearing a cloak made from what looked like living moss. She approached me without fear or aggression, studying me with the same scientific curiosity I was directing toward her and her people. "You are the tree counter," she said in perfect English, though her accent was unlike anything I had ever heard. "We have been watching your people measure our forest for 3 days now." I tried to explain that I was conducting a biodiversity survey, that my work was aimed at protecting the forest from development. She listened patiently, then gestured toward the living dwelling behind her. "We have been protecting this forest for 7 generations," she said. "Our ancestors learned to live with the trees instead of cutting them down, to build with growing wood instead of dead lumber. Your people want to protect the forest by keeping humans away from it. We protect it by becoming part of it." She explained that her community had been living in this valley since before the Cherokee Nation was forced to relocate, that they had chosen to remain hidden rather than join the removal to Oklahoma. Over the generations, they had developed techniques for forest living that left no trace on the ecosystem while providing everything they needed for a sustainable lifestyle. The living architecture was just one example of their innovations. They had learned to cultivate wild plants in ways that increased biodiversity rather than reducing it, to hunt and fish using methods that strengthened animal populations rather than depleting them, and to create tools and clothing from forest materials without damaging the sources. But they also made it clear that their survival depended on remaining hidden from the outside world. Government agencies, environmental groups, and commercial interests would all pose threats to their way of life if their existence became known. They had survived by ensuring that anyone who discovered their community understood the importance of keeping their secret. "Your survey will recommend that this area be protected," the woman continued. "That is good. But your report will not mention us, and you will not return here again. We have ways of making sure the forest keeps its secrets, and we have used those ways before when necessary." The threat was delivered without hostility, but with absolute certainty. These people had remained hidden for over a century, and had clearly developed methods for dealing with unwanted discovery. I had no doubt that they possessed both the knowledge and the will to eliminate any threat to their security. I spent the rest of that day being shown through their community, observing construction techniques and forest management practices that revolutionized my understanding of sustainable living. They had created a civilization that existed in perfect harmony with the natural environment, taking only what they needed and giving back more than they consumed. Their knowledge of plant biology, animal behavior, and ecological relationships exceeded anything I had learned in graduate school or 17 years of professional experience. They knew things about forest ecosystems that modern science had not yet discovered, and they had used that knowledge to create a way of life that was both primitive and incredibly sophisticated. But they also made it clear that this knowledge would not be shared with the outside world. Their survival depended on remaining hidden, and they had learned through bitter experience that contact with modern civilization meant destruction of their way of life. I left the next morning with a complete understanding of why this forest had seemed so empty of wildlife. The animals were there, but they had learned to hide from human observers. The forest dwellers had trained them to avoid contact with outsiders, creating an illusion of emptiness that helped protect the community's secret. My official report recommended the area for wilderness protection based on the exceptional size and age of the old-growth trees. I made no mention of the human community or their remarkable innovations in sustainable forest living. As far as the Forest Service is concerned, the valley contains nothing but trees. But sometimes when I am conducting surveys in other remote forest areas, I find myself looking for signs of similar communities. I study unusual tree growth patterns and wonder if they might be evidence of living architecture. I listen for the absence of wildlife sounds that might indicate human habitation designed to remain hidden. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 600,000 acres of wilderness, much of it never fully explored or documented. There is room in that vast expanse for communities that have learned to live without leaving traces. People who have chosen to remain part of the natural world rather than trying to dominate it. They are still there, protecting the forest by becoming one with it, maintaining knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of sustainable living. But that knowledge will remain hidden as long as the outside world continues to view wilderness as something to be either exploited or preserved, rather than something to live with as equals.